There's something haunting about the silence of ancient Egyptian ruins, the towering columns, the sun-bleached statues, the hieroglyphs carved in stone. They stand still in time, but they whisper, faintly, of lives once lived with urgency and desire. We often look at these monuments and think only of gods and pharaohs, of battles and tombs, but rarely do we stop and wonder, how did these people love? How did they touch? What was sex like in ancient Egypt, thousands of years before our modern world would obsess over purity and shame? The ancient Egyptians lived according to an entirely different rhythm, a rhythm that flowed like the Nile, cyclical and sacred. For them, sex was not merely a biological act, it was cosmic. It was part of the divine order, sewn into the very fabric of the universe. To ignore it would be to ignore life itself. The Egyptians did not speak of sex with the same tension or awkwardness that would later color the conversations of Victorian scholars or monotheistic priests. Instead, they folded it into their understanding of nature and the gods. Just as the Nile flooded to bring new life to the soil, so too did sex bring life to the body, the family, and the soul. This wasn't just a private matter, it was a cultural truth written into their stories, their myths, their art. In one of their oldest creation stories, the god Atom brings forth existence not through war or command, but through a solitary act of masturbation. From his seed, the world is born. Such was the reverence the Egyptians held for sexuality. It was not sinful, it was sacred. Sex, in their world, was life. It was fertility, pleasure, renewal. It was magic and medicine. It was ritual. And though time has buried much of their daily existence beneath sand and stone, fragments remain. Erotic poems scribbled on faded papyrus, delicate carvings of lovers on tomb walls, amulets shaped like genitals, worn not in shame but in celebration. Yet for all their openness, the Egyptians were not careless. There were boundaries and spoken rules shaped by status, family, and tradition. Marriage was honored, fidelity expected, and power often dictated freedom. But even within these lines, desire found a way to breathe. It danced in secret gardens, whispered through poetry, and lived quietly in the night. Unlike many ancient societies, Egyptian women enjoyed notable freedoms. They could own property, divorce their husbands, and control aspects of their sexual lives. Virginity, oddly enough, was not obsessively prized. Love mattered more. Compatibility, affection, even passion, these were the pillars upon which many unions were built. But marriage was not always romantic, especially among the elite. It was a tool in arrangement to secure alliances or maintain bloodlines. In the royal family, incest was sometimes practiced, a fact that shocks modern sensibilities but made sense in a culture where gods were siblings and the pharaoh was divine. And yet, love still found its place. In humble homes and golden palaces, alike, couples shared more than duty. They shared laughter, longing, intimacy. Erotic poetry from the New Kingdom speaks of stolen glances and secret trysts, of hearts beating fast beneath linen robes, of lips that trembled with want. Even in death, the Egyptians did not abandon their sensuality. Tombs sometimes included spells to ensure sexual potency in the afterlife. A man might request that his virility continue beyond the grave, that he might enjoy the pleasures of the flesh in eternity, just as he had in life. Sex was not confined to bedrooms or backrooms. It appeared in temple rituals, in agricultural festivals, in symbolic acts meant to ensure fertility for the land and its people. It was present in their medicines, their magic, their myths. It was everywhere, as natural and necessary as water and wind. Still, they were human. They struggled with jealousy, infidelity, heartbreak. There were legal penalties for adultery, especially for women, though punishments varied depending on class. Even in a sexually accepting culture, betrayal could still wound deeply. Prostitution existed, too, sometimes tolerated, sometimes condemned. Some temples may have even hosted sacred sexual rites, though the evidence is debated. What is clear is that sexuality was not hidden, it was discussed, depicted, and even joked about. The ancient Egyptians had humor, after all. They were not solemn statues, they were people. And people get lonely, people fall in love, people make mistakes. The Egyptians knew this. Their writings reflect it. In poems and letters, you find not just the lust of the body, but the ache of absence, the thrill of desire, the comfort of touch. What's most surprising is not how different they were from us, but how similar. Despite the millennia between their world and ours, the essence of human intimacy has not changed. The need to connect, to hold someone close, to feel desired, it's ancient, eternal. So when we ask what sex was like in ancient Egypt, we're not just peering into a distant past. We're looking at ourselves, reflected through time, at our wants, our vulnerabilities, our love. Perhaps that's the true magic of Egypt, not just its pyramids or its gods, but the quiet reminder that, beneath all the layers of time and sand, we've always been human. And being human has always meant wanting to be touched, to be seen, to be loved. The human body, in the eyes of ancient Egyptians, was not a cage to be escaped, or a shameful shell to be hidden. It was a vessel of balance, power, and divinity. Every curve, every gesture, every visible inch of skin played a role in the grand story of life and death. To look at the body was to look at something sacred, but not distant, something divine, but not unreachable. Theirs was a world view where flesh and spirit were not enemies but companions. When we imagine ancient modesty, we often see veils and robes, bodies wrapped tightly and kept out of view. But in ancient Egypt, this wasn't always the case. In fact, many depictions of daily life, fetched on tomb walls or painted on pottery, show men, women, and even children wearing minimal clothing, especially in the sweltering heat of the Nile Valley. Linen garments were light, often translucent. Nudity, particularly among the working class, was not unusual. For children, it was expected. There was no embarrassment in the unclothed form. The body was a tool, a creation of the gods, and it was designed to function with purpose and beauty. Even laborers and servants, often portrayed in the nude, were not painted to humiliate or reduce them but to reflect their honest condition, their humanity, their role in the ecosystem of Egyptian life. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous, observers of the human figure. In their art, each body part was drawn deliberately, according to a fixed canon of proportions. The ideal male form was athletic, upright, broad-shouldered. The ideal female figure was slender, high-waisted, and graceful. These were not arbitrary preferences. They were visual expressions of balance, what the Egyptians called mat. To be healthy, to be symmetrical, to be whole, this was the highest physical aspiration. But their appreciation of the body wasn't merely aesthetic, it was functional. The body housed the ka, the vital life force, and the ba, the spirit or personality. At death, these spiritual components would separate, but the body remained crucial. Without it, the soul could not be reborn. This is why the preservation of the body through mummification was so essential. Flesh, even after death, had power. It was a bridge between the worlds. Every organ, every limb, held symbolic value. The heart, not the brain, was believed to be the seat of thought and emotion. It would be weighed in the afterlife to determine one's fate. The liver, lungs, and stomach were carefully removed and stored in canopic jars, not simply for decay, prevention, but because each organ had cosmic associations. They belonged to specific protective deities, each with their own domain in the universe. Taut hair was another important feature of the body. Children often wore the side lock of youth, a single braid or lock of hair on an otherwise shaved head. Adult men and women styled their hair or wore elaborate wigs, often perfumed and adorned. Wigs were not just fashion, they were a mark of status, ritual, and respectability. Body hair was generally removed, especially by the upper class, in pursuit of cleanliness and purity. Cosmetics, too, played a profound role. Both men and women painted their eyes with kohl, a black pigment made from galena. It was beautiful, yes, but also functionally it protected against the sun's glare and reduced the risk of eye infections. Red ochre was used to color lips and cheeks. Fragrances made from oils, myrrh, and lotus were applied to the skin. The body was not hidden, it was polished, enhanced, celebrated. Yet this celebration of the body did not lean toward excess or vanity. There was a balance, always. Gluttony, obesity, or laziness were frowned upon in royal inscriptions and tomb art. Pharaohs were idealized in youthful strength, regardless of their actual age. The body was to be cared for, not indulged. To overdo was to tip the scales of court disorder and decay. Religious practices often involved the body in symbolic acts. Priests had to bathe, shave, and purify their bodies multiple times a day. Sexual acts could be part of fertility rituals, where the body became an instrument of divine renewal. Offerings to gods included food, drink, incense, but also images of physical beauty and perfection. The gods, after all, were often imagined with ideal human forms. The temples and tombs told stories, not just with words, but with bodies. A priest pouring water, a dancer mid-motion, a mother nursing a child. The way the body was posed, the angle of a hand, the curve of a back all, spoke volumes. The human form was a language of its own. In medical papyri, we find another layer of how Egyptians regarded their bodies. They documented ailments and treatments with startling precision. Doctors and healers called SNOR treated everything, from toothaches to infertility. The human body was not mysterious in the mystical sense. It was understandable, treatable, manageable, a machine that could be studied, diagnosed, and maintained. And yet, they didn't divorce the physical from the magical. A broken bone might be set with splints and salves, but also accompanied by a spell. A headache might warrant both herbs and a protective amulet. The body was not just chemicalite, was spiritual, and every wound, every sensation, had meaning. Beyond the surface. In love and intimacy, this deep respect for the body extended even further. Erotic poems praised not just beauty, but sensation. Descriptions of skin, fragrance, and movement filled stanzas with soft awe. The beloved's walk, their laughter, their hairthes were not just physical traits, but portals into divine affection. Even in the realm of law and punishment, the body was central. Corporal punishment could be severe, yes, but there were also laws protecting physical integrity. Assaults and abuses had consequences. The body, even in a legal sense, was not property, was sacred space. In death, the body became holy in a different way, cleaned, anointed, and wrapped with care. It was not just disposed of, it was prepared for a second life. Mummification was the final act of love and preservation. Every toe, every finger, every tooth had to remain intact, for resurrection depended on physical wholeness. The human body, then, was never seen as an obstacle or a temptation. It was not something to be denied, but something to be embraced with dignity, control, and wonder. It was capable of great pleasure, great suffering, and great transformation. It could carry life, carry spirit, and carry memory. In this ancient worldview, the body was not separate from the cosmos. It echoed the stars, the river, the sun. It was a small universe within the larger one, a vessel, a temple, a tool. To honor the body was to honor the gods who shaped it, and in honoring their own flesh, the Egyptians left us a powerful legacy, one that reminds us that the human form, in all its beauty and imperfection, has always been more than just skin and bone. It has always been a story. Understanding the sexuality of a civilization that vanished over 3,000 years ago is no easy task. There are no diaries to read, no recorded conversations to overhear, no private letters tucked away in old drawers. And yet, in the case of ancient Egypt, traces still linger, etched in stone, brushed in faded pigment, and written in symbols on crumbling papyri. The sounds of time may have buried their voices, but not completely. Whispers remain. These whispers come to us in fragments. No single scroll or monument tells us everything. But when you gather the pieces, when you sit with them patiently, they begin to tell a fuller story. One shard of pottery might show a couple in a tender embrace. A tomb painting might depict a naked servant girl pouring wine. A medical scroll might describe a method for stimulating fertility. Each piece alone is a riddle. Together, they form a mosaic. Among the most important sources we rely on are the ancient papyrithos, fragile sheets made from the reeds of the Nile. Some were administrative, others poetic, and a few surprisingly candid. The Turin erotic papyrus, now held in an Italian museum, stands as one of the most controversial and explicit documents ever uncovered from the ancient world. Its illustrations depict exaggerated, even humorous, sexual scenes, suggesting that the Egyptians not only acknowledged sexual pleasure, they laughed with it. The Turin papyrus is both tantalizing and perplexing. Scholars debate its purpose. Was it a satirical artwork, a guidebook, a piece of private entertainment commissioned by someone wealthy and curious? Whatever its intent, it leaves little doubt that sexuality was not hidden from artistic expression. It was bold, graphic, unapologetic, and it opens a rare, unfiltered window into Egyptian sexual imagination. But not all our evidence is so flamboyant. Much of what we know about Egyptian sex and intimacy is indirectly gleaned from love poetry, mythological texts, and medical treatises. These writings may not mention intercourse explicitly, but they hint at longing, at touch, at desire. The Chester Beatty Papyrus, for example, contains love poems filled with sensual language. They describe the beloved's voice as sweet as honey, their presence more intoxicating than wine. The emotional landscape of attraction is mapped out in careful, fragrant metaphors. Tomb art is another silent witness. On the walls of burial chambers and temples, men and women are shown in tender or domestic moments. Though full nudity is rare in these formal depictions, partial nudity, exposed breasts, sheer garments, suggestive postures is common, especially in scenes of dancing, celebration, or fertility. These images were not considered indecent. They were part of life. They were beautiful, necessary, and alive with symbolic meaning. Statues, amulets, and figurines also tell a story, albeit one wrapped in ritual and magic. Small carvings of nude women, often with exaggerated hips and breasts, were common fertility charms. They weren't erotic in the modern sense, but rather devotional. They honored the female form as a life-giver, a protector, a magical conduit of birth and renewal. More unusual, but equally telling, are the birthing bricks, rectangular platforms on which women would squat during childbirth. These bricks were sometimes inscribed with protective spells and images. Some included references to intimacy, conception, and the continuation of life. Even in the practical tools of labor, the Egyptians embedded reminders of where life begins, in the closeness between two bodies. In temples, we find yet another layer of evidence. Some rituals involved symbolic unions between gods and goddesses, reenacted by priests and priestesses. These ceremonies may not have involved actual sex, but the metaphors were clear. Fertility, cosmic balance, and the renewal of the land were all mirrored in the language of union. To represent sex was to represent harmony between divine forces. There are also the legal records lists of crimes, disputes, and punishments. Occasionally, they speak of sexual misconduct, adultery, or accusations of assault. From these, we learn what was considered acceptable, what was frowned upon, and how sexual behavior was policed. While these documents are brief and often vague, they offer rare glimpses into the moral boundaries of the time. Ancient Egyptian medical papyri are surprisingly frank. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, dating to around 1800 BCE, discusses fertility treatments, contraceptive methods, and gynecological health. It includes recipes for vaginal suppositories made from honey, crocodile dung, and acacia bark. Attempts to control reproduction. In reading them, we see that sex was not only about pleasure or ritual, it was practical. It had consequences that had to be managed, protected, and understood. Mythology, too, plays a central role. The gods were not distant, asexual beings. They had families, lovers, rivalries, even incestuous relationships. The story of Osiris and Isis, for example, includes themes of death, dismemberment, magical sex, and resurrection. When Isis reassembled her slain husband and conceived their child, Horus, it was not just myth, it was a symbolic statement. Sex is part of life, even after death. Creation and intimacy are eternal. We also learn from architecture. The layout of houses often included private rooms, suggesting spaces for sleeping, birthing, and intimacy. Though modest by today's standards, these domestic areas hint at private lives lived behind closed doors, at shared beds, whispered words, and closeness that leaves no written trace. Clothing and fashion add subtle clues. As mentioned before, sheer linen was common, especially among women. Artwork frequently shows slim-fitting dresses with visible curves beneath. Jewelry emphasized the neck, the waist, the hips. Beauty mattered, not just in temples or palaces, but in bedrooms. The Egyptians knew how to adorn the body to enhance its allure. Even graffiti plays its part. On the walls of workers' villages and stone quarries, scribbles and drawings survive. Some crude, some poetic piece markings, often left by laborers, speak of longing, jealousy, and desire. In them, we find an honesty that formal records often lack. They're not official, they're human. Artifacts from burial sites, like figurines of couples or phallic charms, suggest that sexual vitality was hoped to continue into the afterlife. A man might be buried with an amulet shaped like a penis, not as a joke, but but as a blessing. It meant he would still be a man in the world beyond, capable of pleasure, capable of life. And then there is silence, the absence of evidence, the gaps in the record. There are things we may never know, the secret gestures, the private conversations, the rules whispered from mother to daughter, father to son. These vanished in the dust. But the fragments we do have, scattered across tombs and temples and scrolls, allow us to imagine what once was, through myth, medicine, poetry, and paint. Ancient Egyptians left behind an incomplete, but rich tapestry. They didn't write books titled Sex and the Egyptian Way, but they didn't need to. Their worldview, their rituals, and their art speak volumes. You just have to learn how to listen. And when you do, when you sit quietly with the stone and the papyrus, when you read between the lines and see beyond the brushstrokes, you begin to understand that the Egyptians weren't so different after all. They longed, they touched, they loved, and in their own language, they left behind the memory of it. Long before the first pyramid rose from the desert floor, before the pharaohs reigned or the Nile was charted, the Egyptians imagined a beginning not of kings or cities, but of existence itself. And at the center of that beginning was an act of creation that was deeply, unmistakably sexual. For the ancient Egyptians, the world did not erupt from chaos in violence or command. It was born through desire, through the body, through the sacred act of generation. According to one of the oldest creation myths from Heliopolis, the universe began with a single being, Atom, the first god, the original presence in a formless void. There was no earth yet, no sky, no stars, just Atom, standing alone in the primordial waters called None, with no companion, no partner. He created the first gods through a solitary act. He masturbated. From this act of self-pleasure, Atom brought forth Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Together, they would give rise to the world as the Egyptians knew it: sky and earth, night and day, the cycle of life. But the origin remained deeply physical. The act of creation was not abstract. It was intimate. The very first moment of existence was sexual in nature, and not only accepted, it was revered. This origin story, radical even by modern standards, sets the tone for how the Egyptians understood the cosmos. Creation was not a sterile process. It was not spoken into being. It came from the body, from sensation, from the private becoming cosmic. Atom's seed was the spark that awakened the universe. His body was the vessel of all things to come. In another version of the myth, Atom sneezes or spits Shu and Tefnut into being. But even here the metaphor remains physical. Bodily fluids, whether seed, spit, or tears, are not seen as waste or shameful. They are creative forces, life-bearing substances. They are sacred because they originate within the divine form. And just as Atom created alone, other gods continued the work of generation through union. Shu and Tefnut gave birth to Geb, the god of the earth, and Nut, the goddess of the sky. The two loved each other deeply, so much so that they clung together in an eternal embrace. But their closeness threatened to halt the unfolding of creation. So their father, Shu, separated them, lifting Nut to become the heavens and pressing Geb down to form the earth. And so the world found its space. Still, even in separation, the intimacy between Nut and Geb remained. In temple carvings, Nut is often shown arching protectively over the earth, her star-speckled body stretching from horizon to horizon. Geb, beneath her, gazes upward. Their positions are not just symbolic, they are sensual. The earth longs for the sky curves to protect the earth. The world is born of longing. The relationship between Isis and Osiris adds yet another dimension to Egypt's sexual mythology. Osiris, god of the afterlife, was killed and dismembered by his jealous brother Seth. His body parts were scattered across Egypt, and his loyal wife, Isis, embarked on a quest to recover them. She found all but one, his phallus. According to the myth, it had been thrown into the Nile and eaten by a fish. But Isis did not give up. Using her magic, she reassembled Osiris's body and fashioned a new phallus. Then, in one of the most intimate and mystical moments in Egyptian lore, she hovered over his lifeless body, transformed herself into a bird, and conceived their son, Horus, through a divine act of posthumous sex. In doing so, she restored life not just to Osiris, but to Egypt itself. This myth is often interpreted as a tale of resurrection, but at its core, it is also a love story, a tale of desire, of union beyond death, of the power of sex not as lust, but as salvation. Isis's act was one of grief, devotion, and rebirth. Through sex, she reclaimed order from chaos. Through sex, she brought balance to the world. The Egyptians saw this pattern of death and renewal, separation and reunion in every part of life. The flooding of the Nile, which brought fertility to the land each year, was itself linked to the tears of Isis. The river's cycle mirrored the cycles of the body, the rhythms of passion and rest, of union and solitude. Sex was not isolated from these patterns, it was part of them. In fact, many festivals across Egypt celebrated fertility and love in explicit, joyful ways. During the Feast of the Valley or the Festival of Hathor, women sang love songs, couples drank wine, and erotic poetry was recited openly. Statues of gods and goddesses were paraded in public, sometimes with exaggerated sexual features, to bless the fields and families. These were not vulgar events, they were sacred. A reaffirmation that life springs from closeness, from contact, from shared bodies. Hathor, goddess of music, dance, and love, was one of the most sensual deities in the Egyptian pantheon. She was often depicted as a beautiful woman with cow horns and a sun disk. Her temples were filled with images of joy, pleasure, and affection. Lovers invoked her name. Women wore amulets of her likeness to enhance their desirability. To honor Hathor was to embrace sensuality, not shun it. Even Min, the god of male virility, was portrayed with an erect phallus symbol, not of obscenity, but of strength, fertility, and creation. Offerings were made to him during harvest festivals to ensure the soil's fertility. The same organ that could father a child could also make the grain grow tall. This was the Egyptian mindset. All creation, whether human or agricultural, flowed from the same sacred source. Sex in Egyptian mythology was not just a metaphor, it was a blueprint. The gods modeled it, the myths reenacted it, the people imitated it. And through these stories, a message was repeated, that sex is not dirty, not dangerous, not taboo. It is powerful, it is sacred. It is, in fact, the way the universe began. What's remarkable is how openly these myths circulated. They were told not just in temple rituals, but in popular stories, in festivals, in art. Children likely heard them, adults lived by them. They were not hidden behind veils or encoded in secret language. They were part of the cultural air. The creation myths of Egypt give us something rarer. Civilization that embraced sexuality, not as a weakness or a threat, but as a divine truth. Where other ancient religions feared the flesh, Egypt honored it. Where others condemned desire, Egypt celebrated it. Theirs was a world where sex was not an obstacle to spirituality, but a path toward it. And in listening to these myths, in tracing the gods' stories across temple walls and broken scrolls, we remember something that modernity sometimes forgets, that sex has always been more than just a private act. It is a story, a symbol, a sacred language written not only in stone, but in the stars, the river, and the beating heart of the human soul. To live in ancient Egypt was to live within the rhythms of the natural world, the rising and falling Nile, the cycle of the seasons, the turning of the stars overhead. Everything had its order, its purpose. Sex, too, was part of this sacred pattern, not separate from it. It wasn't hidden in back rooms or confined to shameful whispers. It was an open current in the river of life. The Egyptians did not treat sex as something forbidden or embarrassing. They treated it as something normal, expected. Joyful sex, for them, was as ordinary as eating, as sleeping, as breathing. It was not reserved for rare moments, nor treated with suspicion. It was a human need, a divine gift, and a celebration of connection. Whether between husband and wife, lovers, or through magical rites, it was understood as part of the human design. The gods had modeled it, the land demanded it, and the people embraced it. This acceptance is seen most clearly in their poetry. Erotic verses from the New Kingdom period don't read like coded metaphors. They speak openly of desire, of longing, of physical attraction. A lover might be described as having skin like polished gold, eyes like stars, or hips that sway like the breeze over lotus ponds. These were not merely compliments, they were invocations of nature's beauty, reflected in the body of the beloved. Some of these poems survive in the Chester Beatty, the first papyrus, where young men and women exchange verses that are tender, suggestive, and filled with the excitement of new love. One poem speaks of a woman waiting by the riverbank, watching for her lover's boat to arrive. Another describes a man so overcome by a woman's voice that he forgets to eat or drink. Desire, in these verses, is not sinful. It is sacred hunger. Egyptian art also reflects this openness. On tomb walls, household scenes show couples reclining together, sometimes with children playing nearby. Servants bring drinks. Musicians strum harps. There is no fear in these depictions, only comfort. The body is shown in gentle, affectionate poses, sometimes with bare breasts or suggestive postures. These were scenes of pleasure, of rest, of love. The afterlife, after all, was meant to be filled with joy. Among the working class, where homes were small and privacy limited, sex still found its space. Couples might lie together on mats behind simple linen partitions. Desire did not depend on luxury. It lived in laughter, in shared meals, in quiet looks across firelit rooms. It was not always poetic, but it was always present. It was part of life's flow, like wind across sand. In festivals and community celebrations, sexuality was often woven into the rituals. During the Feast of Drunkenness, associated with the goddess Hathor, participants drank wine, danced wildly, and sang songs of desire and renewal. The goal wasn't chaos, it was catharsis, a collective return to passion, to play, to the primal joy of being alive. To the Egyptians, this was healing, not harmful. Even agricultural festivals acknowledged sex's power. The fertility of the land was linked to human fertility. Priests performed symbolic rites that echoed the union of gods, asking the heavens to bless both womb and soil. The act of sex, in this view, was not just pleasure, it was sacred magic, a spell cast for abundance and life. In temples, priests and priestesses were expected to remain ritually pure, but this did not mean celibate. Purity meant bathing regularly, shaving body hair, and avoiding certain acts before ceremonies. Outside of that, priests were free to marry, to love, and to have families. Sex was not a threat to spirituality, it was a thread within it. Sexual health was a known field. Medical papyri record methods for contraception, fertility enhancement, and even honey, acacia bark, and dates were commonly used in herbal remedies. Women took charge of their reproductive choices as best they could. There was no great moral weight placed on when or how often a woman became pregnant. Control over the body was viewed as practical, not taboo. Beauty and attraction were openly celebrated. Men and women alike wore scented oils, applied makeup, and styled their hair with care. Kohl-lined eyes, rouged cheeks, and perfumed skin were tools of seduction and self-expression. A well-scented body was a signal of cleanliness, vitality, and readiness for closeness. It was a gesture of desire made visible. Even clothing carried sensual undertones. Women's dresses were often made from fine linen, woven so thin that the shape of the body beneath was visible. This was not scandalous, it was stylish. In the heat of the desert sun, light garments were a necessity, but they also allowed the body to remain part of the conversation, not something to be hidden. Children were often nude until adolescence, and nudity itself was not inherently shameful. It depended on context. The human form, when displayed respectfully, was simply another part of creation. There was no blanket rule that said skin equaled sin. That idea would come much later, from cultures shaped by guilt and dualism. The Egyptians did set boundaries, of course. Adultery, particularly when committed by women, could carry social consequences, but these were practical concerns, tied to inheritance, honor, and family reputation, not divine punishment. Sex itself was never seen as the problem. It was the betrayal that mattered, not the act. Even in art meant for private eyes, like the Turin erotic papyrus, we see a playful, humorous approach to sex. The exaggerated scenes were likely intended to entertain, not shock. They remind us that Egyptians, like us, had fantasies, jokes, curiosities. They weren't solemn statues. They were people curious, laughing, teasing, exploring. In the afterlife, many Egyptians believed they would continue to enjoy the pleasures of the flesh. Tomb inscriptions include requests for sexual potency, fertility, and companionship beyond death. The ideal afterlife wasn't a clouded bodiless, it was an echo of Earth's joys, made perfect. Fields of grain, good food, clean rivers, and someone to lie beside. This vision of sex as natural, joyful, and integral to life runs throughout their culture. It wasn't something to hide or suppress. It was something to nurture, like a plant, or a child. To the Egyptians, love was not dangerous, it was divine. The body was not an enemy, it was a miracle. And in a world that often ties sex to guilt, fear, or power, the Egyptian perspective offers something different, something softer, something wiser. A reminder that the union of two bodies, far from sinful, might just be one of the oldest forms of worship the world has ever known. In ancient Egypt, gender was not a rigid binary so much as a set of roles, fluid at times, firmly shaped at others, woven into the wider fabric of divine order. It was a framework through which people moved, shaped by myth, law, biology, and belief. To be male or female carried responsibilities, privileges, and expectations, especially when it came to love, sex, and family. But unlike later cultures that imposed harsh limits on one gender or exalted the other, the Egyptians approached these roles with a sense of balance, echoing the larger cosmic harmony they called Mat. Men were generally seen as the initiators. In relationships tasked with pursuing, proposing, protecting, they were expected to provide stability, to be present, to lead the household. But this leadership was not absolute. A man's honor lay not in domination, but in fulfilling his duties as husband, father, and provider. Sexually, he was expected to be potent, attentive, and, ideally, faithful. But his fidelity was not always enforced with the same cultural weight as a woman's. Women, on the other hand, were not passive figures locked behind doors. In fact, in many ways, ancient Egyptian women enjoyed rights that would not be seen again for thousands of years. They could own property, inherit land, initiate divorce, and conduct business. In sexual relationships, they were seen not only as recipients, but as participants. Desire was acknowledged, sometimes even expected. Love poems speak of women taking the lead, calling to their lovers, inviting them close, dreaming of their touch. Marriage was a central institution, though not always formalized with state documents. A couple could be considered married simply by living together and referring to each other as spouses. There were no grand religious wedding rituals, just a mutual agreement, sometimes arranged by families, sometimes born from love. Within that union, sexual expectations varied by class, status, and circumstance. Fidelity was more strictly demanded of women, particularly among the elite. A woman's adultery could bring shame upon her family and even threaten inheritance lines, especially when property was passed through bloodlines. In rare cases, it could lead to legal consequences. Men, though encouraged to remain loyal, were not judged with the same severity. Social structures, rather than religious commandments, set these standards. But despite these differences, mutual affection was often at the heart of relationships. Many tomb inscriptions describe spouses not just as partners, but as beloved. Husbands praised their wives' beauty and wisdom. Wives described their husbands as kind and strong. The language is warm, personal, and often deeply romantic. These weren't cold contracts, they were connections. Gender also played a role in religious symbolism. Male gods typically represented order, fertility, and protection. Female goddesses embodied magic, motherhood, and sensual power. But these roles were not fixed. Many goddesses like Isis and Sekhmet were both nurturing and terrifying, soft and ferocious. Male gods could be vulnerable, even weeping. The gods reflected human complexity, not caricatured roles. This divine fluidity echoed in daily life. In some cases, women served as priests, scribes, or temple musicians. Some held high administrative roles. In rare instances, women even ruled. The land Hatshepsut, most famously taking on kingly titles and regalia. Gender did not bar power, it only shaped how that power was expressed. In sexual contexts, women were often admired for their beauty, charm, and fertility. Men were praised for strength, virility, and wisdom. But these ideals were flexible. A man's kindness, or a woman's cleverness, could be just as attractive as their physical traits. Erotic poems reveal that both genders valued presence, voice, and even scent. One poem speaks of a lover whose fragrance is more intoxicating than all the perfumes of Punt. Clothing and adornment reflected these gender ideals. Women often wore form-fitting linen dresses, sometimes sheer, accessorized with jewelry, beads, and scented oils. Men wore kilts or loincloths, their upper bodies bare in the heat. Both genders used cosmetics. Kohl-lined eyes, painted nails, and perfumed skin were common for men and women alike. These were not gendered in the modern sense. They were tools of beauty, attraction, and ritual. Gender also influenced sexual magic and superstition. Amulets were often gendered. A woman might wear one shaped like a frog for fertility, while a man might wear one shaped like the phallus for virility. Spells targeting sexual health or attraction often invoked specific gods or goddesses, depending on the user's gender. These charms were practical, protective, and sometimes erotic. In child-rearing, roles were traditionally divided. Women tended to the young, breastfeeding, bathing, teaching them early skills. Men provided food, worked the fields, served in the army, or maintained family trade. But these roles were not strict. Fathers are sometimes depicted cradling infants. Mothers might oversee economic matters. There was room for overlap, especially among the lower classes where survival demanded flexibility. Sexual orientation, while not discussed in terms we use today, was also shaped by gender norms. Most sexual acts were expected to be between men and women, largely due to procreative importance. Yet, depictions and stories like the myth of Horus and Set suggest that non-heteronormative acts were known, and sometimes used to explore power dynamics or humiliation. The attitude toward these acts was less moral and more political, focused on dominance, not identity. While ancient texts do not openly document same-sex romantic love, this absence doesn't mean such relationships didn't exist. The story of Neonkhnum and Kumhotep, two male officials buried together in a shared tomb with intimate imagery, suggests at least the possibility of a romantic or deeply bonded same-sex relationship, whether brothers, lovers, or something in between. Their closeness challenged simple gender narratives. In domestic life, roles were sometimes negotiated. In elite households, women might have several servants and oversee large estates. In farming villages, wives worked beside their husbands. The expectations weren't entirely fixed by gender. They were shaped by wealth, location, and need. But underlying it all was a sense of partnership, the idea that both male and female were needed to complete the circle. Ultimately, gender roles in ancient Egypt were about harmony, not hierarchy. While men may have held more public power and women more private influence, both were seen as vital. Neither was considered lesser. The pharaoh himself, supposedly divine, was always flanked by queens, goddesses, and female magic. No king could rule alone. No body could create life without another. And in their sexuality, Egyptians reflected this harmony. They knew that desire, like the Nile, flowed in both directions. That passion was not just about performance, but about presence. And that regardless of gender, what mattered most was connection to spirits finding balance, if only for a moment, in the arms of one another. When we imagine the distant world of ancient Egypt, we often think of its statues, tombs, pyramids, cold, unyielding, eternal. But within that world of stone, there also lived paper-thin whispers, poems written in ink on fragile papyrus. These verses, many of them thousands of years old, pulse with warmth. They speak not of war or rule, but of love, of longing, of intimacy, of bodies and hearts reaching for each other in the sun and shadow of the Nile. The ancient Egyptians were not shy about desire. Their poetry did not hide behind metaphor for modesties. Saket used metaphor to decorate, not disguise. A beloved's lips might be compared to lotus petals, their voice to birdsong, their movements to reeds swaying in the floodplain. But behind these soft images was real heat, real yearning. The desire was physical, spiritual, and deeply human. These poems are among the oldest love poetry ever discovered. Many of them come from the New Kingdom period around 1300 BCE and have been found on papyri, like the Chester Beattii papyrus, or inscribed on shards of pottery and limestone flakes, known as astraka. Some are clearly male voices praising women, while others seem to be written from the perspective of women, expressing their own passions with equal clarity and courage. A typical verse might begin with a simple moment, a lover walking by, unaware of the effect they've had. One poem reads, "My heart flutters hastily when I think of my love for you. It lets me not act sensibly. It leaps from its place." The speaker is not concerned with stoicism. Love here is disordering, intoxicating, all-consuming. It is allowed to be wild. Some poems speak of the agony of absence. A lover is late to arrive. The speaker paces, restless, like a lion in a cage. Others describe secret meetings near the riverbank, the sweet anticipation of a touch, the thrill of closeness. In one verse, a girl says, "I shall lie down inside my house and pretend I am ill. Then my neighbor will come to see me and sit beside me for a while." The emotion is playful, but the longing is real. Eroticism is never far from these lines. Many poems are filled with sensual imagery: skin, scent, taste. They delight in the body, not as a vulgar object, but as a sacred site of pleasure and connection. A beloved's hair might be called dark as the raven, their body fairer than fine gold, their embrace sweeter than wine. The body is a garden, a temple, a secret waiting to be discovered. And yet, the tone is rarely crude. The Egyptians understood that eroticism did not require graphic detail. It lived in suggestion, in rhythm, in emotional honesty. One poem describes how the lover's mere presence causes the speaker's heart to flutter like a fish on the line. Another imagines the joy of just sitting close enough to hear them breathe. This subtlety is not restraint, it's intimacy. Interestingly, many poems are from female perspectives, and they are often bold, even assertive. In one, a woman declares, "If only you would come to me, if only you would let me see your face, my heart is filled with longing." There is no shame in her desire, no hesitation in her voice. The women of these poems are not passive recipients of love. They seek it, they crave it, they name it. This openness may surprise modern readers, especially those shaped by later, more repressive cultures. But in ancient Egypt, love and sex were not moral battlegrounds. They were part of life's cycle, necessary, beautiful, fleeting. Poetry captured these moments like a breeze through linen, soft, ephemeral, but unforgettable. The poems often pair emotional longing with natural imagery. The Nile's waters become metaphors for passion. The heat of the sun mirrors the burn of desire. Flowers bloom as lovers approach. Even the fertile soil of the delta becomes symbolic of the female body, awaiting touch, awaiting rain. In this poetic world, nature is not separate from love, it is the language of it. Humor appears. Some verses play with awkwardness, shyness, or teasing. A girl pretends not to notice her admirer. A boy trips over his words. A neighbor gossips. These were not lofty, untouchable lovers. They were real people, filled with nerves, flirtation, and silly games. In their clumsiness, we see ourselves. There's also a deep emotional intelligence in these poems. They understand how love can ache, how it can confuse, how it can fill you with light, and also make you afraid. One poet writes, "My heart longs to be with you, but I fear what others will say." Love here is powerful, but it's vulnerable. These are not declarations shouted from rooftops. They are quiet confessions whispered into the night. The fact that these poems survived is a miracle. They were never meant for eternity. Unlike the inscriptions carved deep into tomb walls, these verses were written on scraps of reed paper, fragile and fleeting. And yet, across centuries of silence, they speak. Their voices are still fresh. Their rhythms still echo in our ears. Reading them, one senses that the Egyptians cherished love, not just as pleasure, but as meaning. To love was to feel truly alive, to be touched, to be held, to be chosen. These were not small things. They were sacred gifts. Even in a land where gods walked among men, where death was conquered with spells, it was love that made life most divine. And perhaps that is why the poetry feels so timeless. It is not locked in its era. It belongs to anyone who has waited, watched, hoped, or dreamed. Anyone who has felt their heart race at the sight of someone's smile. The Egyptians may have lived thousands of years ago, but in these poems, they feel very near. They remind us that love is ancient, that the fluttering heart, the trembling hand, the stolen glance, had always been this way. Long before phones and letters and flowers, someone was already writing, "My desire is to walk with you hand in hand, under the sycamore, until the night falls around us." And someone else, somewhere, was reading it tanned, smiling. Sex in ancient Egypt was not cloaked in secrecy or silence. It was part of the ordinary rhythm of life, like planting fields, lighting lamps, or offering prayers. There were, of course, rules and customs that shaped how people approached intimacy, but at its core, sex was seen as a natural and necessary force. It was tied not just to pleasure, but to balance, healing, family, and even survival. In this way, it was both mundane and magical part of the everyday, yet forever sacred. The Egyptians did not separate the body from the spirit, the way some later cultures would. They believed that physical experiences had spiritual echoes, that human form, with all its curves and hungers, was not an obstacle to divinity, but a reflection of it. This belief shaped how they approached sex, not as something shameful, but as something rooted in cosmic order. It was an act that mirrored the gods and sustained the world. Within marriages, sexual intimacy was expected, even celebrated. Husbands and wives were encouraged to enjoy each other fully. Inscriptions and tomb art show couples embracing, relaxing together, and engaging in moments of closeness. These were not clinical depictions of reproduction. They were emotional, warm, and sometimes even sensual. A good relationship included touch, affection, and sexual fulfillment. There's strong evidence that both men and women were expected to be sexually active. Male potency was admired, but female sexual pleasure was also acknowledged. In erotic poems and festival rituals, women are shown as willing, even eager participants in love. This mutual desire reflects a culture that valued balance in relationships, not domination or submission, but connection. Certain positions and acts were considered more favorable than others, especially when it came to fertility. Though explicit, manuals like those in ancient India do not survive from Egypt. Art and sculpture occasionally depict couples in intercourse. The most common pose appears to be the man standing or kneeling behind the woman, possibly influenced by beliefs about improving conception. Other images hint at foreplay and intimate playfulness. Foreplay itself may have had spiritual as well as sensual significance. Kissing, caressing, and even oral stimulation are alluded to in various erotic and poetic texts. These acts were not condemned. On the contrary, they were likely part of the rhythm of closeness, ways of awakening the body and honoring the other. Intimacy was not rushed, it was an art. Clothing also played a role in sexuality. In daily life, linen garments were often sheer, especially among the lower classes and in the hot climate. This meant that the body was often partially visible, making arousal less taboo. Nudity was not always sexual, but it was never entirely divorced from sensuality either. The visual world was one of softness, of shape, of skin that was rarely hidden. Perfume and oil were essential parts of seduction. Men and women both applied scented unguents, which were believed to not only enhance attractiveness, but also maintain health. Certain scents, such as frankincense, myrrh, and lotus, were associated with arousal. These were not just cosmetics, they were spells of allure, meant to heighten sensation and awaken desire. During major festivals, especially those honoring Hathor, the goddess of love's sexual license, increased. Wine flowed, inhibitions loosened, and symbolic reenactments of divine union were sometimes performed. While these events had ritual frameworks, they also reflected a temporary suspension of social boundaries. Desire was allowed to dance more freely. This openness was not seen as indecency. It was a return to the source, a moment of cosmic celebration. In private, couples used household charms and fertility amulets to protect and bless their sexual lives. Small figurines shaped like naked women, frogs or phalluses, were common in bedrooms. Some were explicitly erotic, others symbolic. These objects were often placed near beds or worn as jewelry. They were thought to encourage successful conception, protect against impotence, or simply maintain harmony between lovers. There were also contraceptive methods, primitive by today's standards, but inventive and sincere. Recipes preserved. In medical papyri describe vaginal pastes made from honey, crocodile dung, acacia bark, and dates. These mixtures were believed to block or kill sperm, or alter the womb's ability to receive it. Whether effective or not, they show that Egyptians thought actively about sexual responsibility and control. Virginity, especially for women, was not obsessively valued. While maidenhood had symbolic weight, there's little evidence that it was strictly enforced or prized above all. What mattered more was honor, family reputation, and mutual respect. Sex before marriage likely occurred, especially during courtships and festivals. It was not always scandalous. Context was everything. Homosexuality remains a debated topic among scholars. While there are no explicit written laws or praises of same-sex relationships, certain artistic and burial choices, like the shared tomb of Neonkhnum and Kumhotep, suggest the possibility of male-male intimacy. Interpretations vary, but what's clear is that the culture did not make sexual orientation a moral battleground. It was behavior and consent, not desire itself, that shaped judgment. Masturbation was not condemned either. In fact, as seen in the myth of Atum. It was considered a powerful, creative act. The first god of the cosmos, alone in the void, brought forth the world through masturbation. This myth suggests that the act was not shameful, but sacred. It was the spark that lit the stars. Incest, at least within the royal family, was practiced as a way of preserving divine bloodlines. Pharaohs often married their sisters, echoing the unions of the gods. While the average Egyptian would not do this, the practice was not viewed with the same horror that later societies would feel. The pharaoh was semi-divine, and his family operated on different spiritual terms. Adultery, particularly by women, could lead to social disgrace or divorce, but it was not always punished by violence or death. Most records show that consequences were financial or reputational. Men could face penalties as well, especially if they seduced a married woman of high rank. There was a clear sense of respect for household boundaries, but not a climate of cruelty or paranoia. Sex work existed, though its legal and social standing is not fully understood. Some women may have worked as dancers or entertainers offering companionship, while others may have sold sex more directly. The line between sacred and profane was not always clear. In some temples, erotic dance and fertility rites were performed as forms of worship, not commerce. Ultimately, the Egyptians believed that sex should be enjoyable, mutual, and in harmony with the needs of the body and the will of the gods. It was a source of laughter, healing, pleasure, and power. Whether in a quiet home, a bustling festival, or the sacred halls of myth, it was always present, sometimes loud, sometimes soft, but always real. And through it all, one belief held strong, that sex was not just about bodies coming together, but about lives entangling, flesh, breath, soul. To touch someone was to know them was to join them, and to join them, even for a moment, was to feel close to the divine. In a quiet vault in the Egyptian Museum of Turin lies a papyrus unlike any other. It is not a map of tombs, nor a list of offerings. It is not a hymn to the gods, or a letter to a king. It is something far more surprising, something that challenges modern assumptions about the ancient world. Known today as the Turin Erotic Papyrus, it is, by most accounts, the oldest known example of illustrated erotic art. In modern terms, it might be called ancient porn. But to understand it that way is to flatten its meaning. What lies on this scroll is far more complex and far more human. The papyrus, which dates to around 1150 BCE, was discovered in fragments in the 19th century. Its original length is unknown, but even in its damaged state, it stretches over 2 meters. What's left reveals a series of explicit sexual scenes, drawn in detailed line work, interspersed with humorous and satirical imagery. These are not shy sketches. They are bold, exaggerated, and deliberately provocative. The scroll is divided into 2 sections. The first is a satirical parade of animals behaving like humans, donkeys playing instruments, lions serving drinks, monkeys dancing. It's absurd and theatrical, almost like an ancient comic strip. But then, the tone changes. The second half plunges into eroticism, a series of graphic images showing men and women in various sexual positions. There are no gods here, no royal figures, just flesh, movement, and fantasy. The men depicted are mostly older, balding, pot-bellied. The women, on the other hand, are young, slim, and often adorned with wigs or jewelry. Their poses are bold and uninhibited. They are shown climbing, bending, straddling. There is no shame in their nudity, no modesty in their gestures. If anything, the power dynamic in these images is balanced or even tipped toward the women. Some scholars believe the papyrus was meant to be humorous or satirical, a kind of bawdy entertainment, perhaps created for a bored scribe or a wealthy patron with a taste for novelty. Others suggest it had ritualistic value, possibly tied to fertility magic or temple satire, but its exact purpose remains a mystery. There is no surviving text to explain its creation. We are left only with the images and our interpretations. What's striking is how openly sexual it is. There's nothing abstract or symbolic about these drawings. They are unmistakably physical, erotic, even pornographic by today's standards. And yet, the Egyptians who created and possibly enjoyed this papyrus didn't seem to treat it as taboo. It survived, after all, not hidden, not destroyed, but preserved. Like any other piece of cultural memory, the figures are drawn with care. The anatomy, while exaggerated, is deliberate. Genitals are prominent. Movements are clear. There's a rhythm to the scroll, like a visual performance, unfolding from one act to the next. Some images are tender, others are playful. One scene shows a woman balancing on a jar while her partner approaches from behind. Another shows lovers embracing mid. There's laughter here, and lust, and something that feels like joy. This papyrus stands in sharp contrast to the restrained elegance of other Egyptian art. On tomb walls, bodies are idealized, frozen in profile, serene. But in the Turin erotic papyrus, bodies twist and sweat and reach. They are not sacred symbols, they are vessels of desire. They are not metaphors, they are people, caught in a moment of wild humanity. And this is perhaps the papyrus's greatest revelation, that the Egyptians, for all their solemn rituals and stone monuments, also had space for sexual play. They made room for humor, fantasy, and indulgence. They were not always serious. They were not always moralistic. Sometimes they were just people, laughing and aroused and curious. That the papyrus has often been excluded from public exhibitions speaks volumes not about the Egyptians, but about us. Modern discomfort with sexual imagery often projects itself backward, assuming that past cultures shared our taboos. But Egypt, for all its mystery and grandeur, was in many ways more honest about the body than we are. Some scholars have tried to downplay the papyrus's content, calling it crude, immature, or meaningless. But that dismissal reveals a modern bias. Why should sex not be worthy of art? Why should humor not be part of heritage? The scroll may not be noble in the traditional sense, but it tells a truth about appetite, about imagination, about what it means to be alive. Others have wondered whether the papyrus was meant to mock certain figures, especially given the unattractive depiction of the men. Could this have been political satire, a way to poke fun at officials or priests? If so, it speaks to a culture where even power could be mocked through sex, where eroticism could become protest, laughter a kind of rebellion. There's also the possibility that the scroll was simply made for fun, that it was passed around at drinking parties or kept in a bedroom chest, that someone, thousands of years ago, unrolled it by lamplight and chuckled, or blushed, or felt their heart quicken, that it served no grand purpose, just pleasure. Yet, even in pleasure, meaning blooms. The Turin erotic papyrus shows that the Egyptians were not repressed, but expressive, not ashamed of desire, but intrigued by it. They could depict sacred union in temple relief sand, then sketch sexual comedy on papyrus. Both were part of life. Both were reflections of the human spirit, and while the scroll may not offer theological insight or royal lineage, it offers something rare, a glimpse into private amusement, into fantasies that may have never been spoken aloud, into the edges of a culture that dared to play, to exaggerate, to arouse. It is a reminder that history is not just what we build in stone, but what we laugh at in secret. In the end, the Turin erotic papyrus is more than ancient porn. It's a fragment of forgotten honesty, a scroll that says, we too had bodies, we too had jokes, we too imagined. And in that small truth, we are not so far from them after all. Marriage in ancient Egypt was not just a legal arrangement or a religious obligation, it was a practical, emotional, and social contract. And though the union itself may not have been formalized in the way modern marriages are, the expectations surrounding it were clear and deeply woven into the rhythm of daily life. A couple could be considered married by mutual agreement and cohabitation. There were no sacred vows or elaborate ceremonies. What mattered more was the act of building a life together. Love, while not required, was certainly welcomed in a marriage. Tomb inscriptions often refer to a spouse as my beloved, or the one with whom I shared happiness. In many ways, this humanized bond, this gentle coexistence, was what marriage aspired to be. It wasn't necessarily romantic by design, but romance often bloomed within it. That affection was not just tolerated, it was admired. Most marriages were monogamous in practice, especially among the lower classes. Resources were limited, and maintaining multiple households would have been difficult. For everyday people, one spouse was enough emotionally, financially, spiritually. In many of these homes, the marriage was a partnership in every sense, raising children, growing food, and navigating the simple yet sacred challenges of life. Among the elite and the royal family, the picture was more complex. Pharaohs sometimes took multiple wives, especially for political alliances. They might have a principal queen, often honored with public statues and temple inscriptions, and secondary wives, whose roles were less formal. Still, even in these households, intimacy and emotional connection were often centered on one primary partner. Adultery, particularly by women, was discouraged and sometimes punished. A wife's fidelity was tied to issues of inheritance and family honor. If a woman was unfaithful, it could throw the legitimacy of children and, thus, property rights into question. This wasn't always about morality. Often, it was about stability and lineage. In rare cases, adultery could lead to public shaming or divorce. More often, it created private turmoil, not legal drama. Men, while technically held to similar standards, were sometimes granted more leeway. A husband's infidelity, unless it involved a woman of high status or another man's wife, was less scandalous. This discrepancy reveals the practical rather than religious nature of sexual morality in Egypt. It was not about divine judgment, it was about social balance. Yet for all these cultural rules, mutual respect seems to have been the guiding ideal. Tomb inscriptions repeatedly speak of wives who were dear to the heart of her husband, or men who were good to their wives in life. These weren't legal statements, they were emotional memories. When someone chose what to say for eternity, they often chose kindness. Marriage could be dissolved. Divorce was not taboo, nor did it ruin reputations. If a union was no longer working, either party could initiate separation. The division of property was often straightforward. Women retained rights to their dowry and any personal belongings. Children typically stayed with the mother, though arrangements varied. The process, while certainly not easy, was accepted as a reality of life. Infertility, too, could test a marriage. Since family and children were essential to legacy, a childless union sometimes led to a second wife or concubine. Still, this wasn't always the case. Some couples remained together in spite of it. There is little evidence that infertile women were consistently blamed or mistreated. Instead, prayers and remedies were sought, spells written, and offerings made to fertility gods. What makes ancient Egyptian marriage so distinctive is its emotional transparency. Love letters and personal artifacts show that people missed their spouses when they were gone. They wrote poems. They mourned deeply. In one letter found in a tomb, a man writes to his deceased wife, saying he cannot sleep without her, that her absence has left the bed cold. These were not staged emotions. They were the raw threads of life. Sex within marriage was not just for reproduction, it was also for joy, bonding, and health. Medical texts refer to sexual frequency, comfort, and even recommendations for enhancing pleasure. There was no sense that sex must only be for children. It was something shared, a regular expression of togetherness, like eating or resting. The idea of marital duty existed, but it was not harsh or joyless. A husband was expected to provide food, clothing, and affection. A wife was expected to care for the home and support her husband's endeavors. But these expectations were not rigid. Gender roles could bend under economic pressure, illness, or love itself. Life was more fluid than law. Jealousy existed, in love poems and moral tales. Rivals sometimes appear in other man admired by the wife, or a neighbor who watches too closely. These tensions were rarely punished by force. Instead, they were dealt with through gossip, withdrawal, or poetry. Emotional landscapes were acknowledged, not denied. Marriage was also shaped by belief in the afterlife. Couples hoped to be reunited beyond death. Tombs often feature husband and wife seated side by side, holding hands, with inscriptions wishing for eternal partnership. This spiritual bond extended far past the physical. It imagined love as something that death could not erase. Monogamy was upheld, not by divine edict, but by cultural preference. It made sense socially and economically. It simplified inheritance. It made daily life manageable, but it wasn't a rigid law. Deviations existed, tolerated when discreet. The ideal was one person, one partner, one home, but the reality, as always, was more nuanced. The moral framework around sex and marriage was thus deeply practical. It protected families, ensured order, and reflected the principles of the ancient Egyptian concept of balance, truth, and harmony. Adultery threatened that balance. Kindness within marriage preserved it. This framework did not rely on guilt, but on mutual responsibility. It asked not what rule did you break, but whom did you hurt. If no harm was done, then discretion, not punishment, followed. The Egyptian view of sexual morality was rooted in the living world, not imposed from the heavens, and perhaps that is what makes it feel so familiar. It was not a list of sins or a battle between flesh and soul. It was a mirror showing how people tried, stumbled, forgave, loved, and lived. Marriage was not perfection. It was a promise to try, a daily practice of choosing one another, of returning home, of sleeping side by side beneath the stars of the Nile sky. In the quiet corridors of history, few subjects are more layered and more misunderstood than prostitution. When we trace it back through time to the riverbanks of ancient Egypt, what we find is not a single truth, but many overlapping stories of survival, desire, ritual, and ambiguity. There were no neon signs, no red light districts as we know them, but there were women and men who exchanged sex for gifts, security, or silver, and a society that seemed to accept this with a mix of practicality and myth. Prostitution in ancient Egypt was not institutionalized in the way it was in later empires, like Rome or Greece. There are no surviving laws that directly ban or legalize it, but evidence from texts, art, and economic records suggests that it existed across social classes, and took many forms, some transactional, others ritualistic, still others entirely personal. It was neither exalted nor universally scorned. The word prostitute is in fact difficult to directly translate into ancient Egyptian. The language doesn't offer a precise equivalent. Instead, we find phrases like Hemite female companion, Shamaite singer, dancer, or simply woman of the night in more poetic references. These women may not have considered themselves sex workers in the modern sense. They were performers, courtesans, house servants, or independent lovers. The lines blurred. Some of these women likely worked in taverns, inns, or public houses, places where beer flowed and men gathered after labor. These spaces, often run by women, offered not just drink but companionship. A dancer might perform, a woman might sit beside a traveler, offer a smile, a story, perhaps more. Whether payment followed was a private matter, not regulated by officials or temples. The Westcar Papyrus, a text from the Middle Kingdom, references tales of seduction and deception, including women disguising themselves for intimate encounters. While not explicitly calling them prostitutes, the context hints at women who used charm and sexuality in public settings. These stories suggest a society familiar with such exchanges and not necessarily scandalized by them. Erotic imagery in tombs and papyri sometimes shows scantily clad women offering lotus flowers or pouring wine-acts, symbolic of both hospitality and seduction. In certain cases, the women are named, their titles hinting at roles as temple musicians or dancers. These titles did not carry shame. On the contrary, some of these women held respected positions in religious festivals where eroticism was woven into sacred rites, which brings us to a more mysterious dimension of ancient sex work, its connection to ritual and religion. In festivals dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of love, music, fertility, and intoxication, women would sing, dance, and even engage in sexual play as offerings to the divine. These acts were not considered sinful. They were sacred. Through sensuality, the divine life force was honored and celebrated. Some scholars have speculated that ritual prostitution may have existed in Egypt, similar to practices in Mesopotamia or QAnon, where women offered their bodies in temples to embody fertility goddesses. However, there is no definitive Egyptian text that confirms this practice as a formal institution. What we do know is that sex and spirituality were not enemies. They shared space. The social perception of prostitutes in ancient Egypt was complex. They were not universally shunned, nor were they embraced as equals. Some were likely marginalized, especially if they operated independently or lacked powerful patrons. Others, particularly those tied to temples or elite households, may have enjoyed relative security. Like many roles in ancient life, one's experience depended heavily on class, context, and luck. Beauty and sensuality were marketable traits. Women wore fine linen, applied kohl around their eyes, perfumed their bodies with oils, and adorned themselves with jewelry. The presentation of the body was not solely for marriage or love. It was part of broader social expression, including courtship, flirtation, and sometimes commercial allure. The legal system doesn't appear to have directly punished prostitution unless it intersected with other crimes, such as adultery with a married elite or disruption of household harmony. This silence in the legal record suggests a kind of tolerated invisibility. As long as such exchanges didn't create scandal or threaten social order, they were quietly accepted. Some references to sex work appear in didactic literature, moralistic writings meant to instruct young men on how to live well. These texts sometimes warn against loose women or advise avoiding taverns, suggesting a cultural awareness of the temptations and perceived dangers of transactional sex. But these warnings are less about morality and more about preserving one's resources, dignity, or reputation. There is also archaeological evidence of brothel-like structures in workmen's villages, such as Deir el-Medina. These spaces contain small, partitioned rooms and graffiti, alluding to sexual encounters. Whether these were truly brothels or simply places of private liaisons remains debated, but they suggest that designated spaces for sex, outside of marriage, did exist. Men, too, may have offered sexual services. While the evidence is scarcer, some inscriptions and images imply that male dancers, musicians, or servants engaged in erotic labor. Their status, like that of their female counterparts, likely ranged from admired to disposable. The concept of masculinity in Egypt was not so rigid as to entirely exclude men from passive or erotic roles. Children born of such liaisons were generally accepted, though their social standing depended on the mother's relationship to the father. In some cases, these children were raised in the mother's household without stigma. In others, especially if inheritance was involved, complications arose, but the state did not interfere in private affairs unless conflict escalated. The emotional lives of sex workers are harder to recover. No diaries survive, no confessions in their own voice. But one can imagine, as with any life shaped by intimacy and uncertainty, a range of feelings: resilience, sadness, independence, longing. Not all would have seen themselves as victims. Some may have chosen their path, others, surely, did not. What is perhaps most striking is that ancient Egypt did not appear to moralize sex work through religion. There was no concept of sin tied to the act of selling one's body. Spiritual purity was measured through balance, cleanliness, and ritual, not by one's sexual history. A prostitute could still pray, still attend festivals, still be buried with respect. In the end, prostitution in ancient Egypt reminds us of a larger truth, that human sexuality, in all its forms, sacred, commercial, loving, fleeting, has always existed in the margins and main streets alike. It is shaped not just by biology or economy, but by belief, opportunity, and need. And within those ancient streets, beneath the sycamores and beside the Nile, women and men met strangers in the quiet of the night. They exchanged touch, coin, perhaps conversation, and then, in the soft morning light, they disappeared again into history, leaving only whispers on papyrus and dreams in stone. In the golden dust of ancient Egypt, life was sacred, but it was also precarious. Every new child brought joy, but also responsibility. And so, for all their reverence for fertility and family, the Egyptians were not blind to the burdens that motherhood could bring. Not every union needed to result in new life. Not every night needed to bear a consequence. And so, quietly, discreetly, the ancient Egyptians developed ways through herbs, rituals, and whispered knowledge to control conception. The idea of birth control is often framed as a modern phenomenon, but in truth, it is as old as intimacy itself. Long before science offered pills and procedures, people sought ways to shape their futures with plants, potions, and prayer. In Egypt, fertility was a gift, but one to be managed with care. Sex was not always for procreation. It was for connection, for pleasure, and sometimes for comfort. In that space, the idea of choice quietly took root. We know of several birth control methods from the medical papyri, especially the Kahun gynecological papyrus, one of the oldest known texts on women's reproductive health, dating to around 1800 BCE. The remedies described are raw, vivid, and striking in their creativity. There are no diagrams, no measured dosages, but there is knowledge passed down from midwives, healers, and wise women who knew the rhythms of the body like they knew the flood of the Nile. One common method involved vaginal pessaries, plugs or pastes inserted into the vagina before intercourse. These were made from mixtures that included honey, crocodile dung, sour milk, natron, a kind of salt, acacia leaves, and sometimes dates. These ingredients weren't chosen at random. Acacia, for example, contains lactic acid, which has mild spermicidal properties. Honey was known for its antibacterial qualities. The dung, while unsettling to modern minds, may have been used for its sticky consistency or symbolic protective power. These mixtures were often applied using lint or fibers, rolled into a ball or wrapped in linen. In this way, they formed a primitive barrier, kind of organic condom. The goal was to block or kill sperm before it could travel into the womb. Whether these methods were truly effective is uncertain. Some may have worked modestly, others may have offered comfort through ritual alone. But the effort speaks volumes. The ancients were thinking, planning, choosing. Contraception wasn't limited to physical barriers. Some texts refer to magical amulets and incantations meant to protect a woman from conception. A small stone, inscribed with sacred symbols, might be worn on a necklace or tucked beneath the bed. Spells invoking deities like Best the dwarf, god of childbirth and protection, or Isis, the divine mother, could be spoken or written on papyrus and carried close to the skin. In this blending of medicine and magic, there was no conflict. The Egyptians did not divide science from spirit. To them, the body was a vessel of divine energy, and healing required both herb and incantation. A woman might drink a bitter tea by moonlight, while a priestess whispered protection over her womb. The boundaries were soft, the belief was strong. Contraceptive practices weren't solely the responsibility of women. Though most surviving texts focus on female anatomy, men, too, were likely advised in matters of timing and withdrawal. Some scholars believe that the coitus interruptus method, withdrawal before ejaculation, may have been practiced, though evidence is sparse. Fertility awareness, even if not fully understood, existed in the form of tracking moon phases, bodily signs, and dream omens. In some cases, prolonged breastfeeding was used as a form of birth spacing. Lactational amenorrhea, where breastfeeding suppresses ovulation, was a natural contraceptive, known even in antiquity. Women often nursed their children for 2 to 3 years, which helped extend the time between births. This practice was both practical and nurturing, a gentle rhythm that benefited both mother and child. Abortion is a more sensitive and uncertain topic. While direct references to abortion are scarce, some medical papyri contain recipes that scholars believe may have been intended to induce menstruation or miscarriage. Ingredients like pomegranate rind, juniper, or castor oil appear in contexts that hint at their use for this purpose. If such practices existed, they were likely whispered, not written. The decision to end a pregnancy would have been deeply, possibly dangerous. There is no strong evidence that contraception carried moral stigma in ancient Egypt. Sex itself was not seen as shameful, and control over one's body was part of the natural order. Unlike later societies where chastity was bound tightly to virtue, the Egyptians took a more pragmatic view. What mattered was harmony. Disruption to family life, inheritance, or social order was a concern, but a woman using a honey-based pessary, that was simply wisdom. Contraceptive practices were likely passed down through women's mothers, midwives, sisters, temple priestesses. They were not part of state medicine or taught in schools. This was whispered, knowledge trusted, revered, and deeply personal. In villages along the Nile, under the flickering light of oil lamps, these remedies were shared with tenderness and care. Among the elite, contraceptive knowledge may have also served political ends. A queen who controlled her fertility could influence succession. A concubine who became pregnant might rise in status. In these circles, the stakes of conception were high. Control, therefore, was power. Discretion was everything. It's also important to consider that while contraception existed, it wasn't always accessible or desired. Many couples welcomed children as gifts from the gods. A large family was seen as a sign of prosperity. The tension between pleasure and procreation, between desire and destiny, was ever present. Some women protected their wombs, others offered them openly to fate. Sex, when separated from reproduction, took on a different light. It became an act of closeness, of release, of joy. The availability of contraception, however crude, allowed for this freedom. It gave couples choice, it gave women agency, however subtle. And in a world where life and death walked side by side, that agency was precious. Even in the afterlife, fertility mattered. Spells in the Book of the Dead sometimes reference the rebirth of sexual potency. A man might hope to be virile in the field of reeds. A woman might hope to be whole and desirable again. This longing didn't end with life, it transcended it. In the end, the story of contraception in ancient Egypt is not just one of herbal recipes and linen plugs. It is the story of people trying to live with intention, to shape their futures, to find space for love, lust, and laughter without fear. It is a reminder that even in the oldest corners of history, the desire to choose has always burned quietly beneath the skin. In ancient Egypt, there was no rigid wall between the physical and the mystical. Every breath, every action, every desire lived under the gaze of gods and spirits. And in the dim glow of oil lamps, beneath star-washed skies, people whispered invocations not just for protection, but for passion. They turned to the unseen world to attract lovers, conceive children, heal broken hearts, and ignite fading flames. In Egypt, sex and magic were not separate spheres, they were partners in the dance of life. From the banks of the Nile to the echoing halls of temples, magic was part of daily existence. It wasn't viewed as dark or forbidden. It was natural, a tool, much like farming or medicine, used to bring balance and maintain the sacred order. And just as people prayed for rain or health, they also sought enchantments for love, lust, fertility, and pleasure. Fertility spells were among the most sacred forms of erotic magic. A woman struggling to conceive might seek the help of a Heka priest or a midwife versed in sacred arts. Together, they might mix a potion from ground dates, milk, and crushed plants like acacia or juniper. These were not merely medicinal ingredients, they were symbols of sweetness, vitality, and the divine feminine. The potion would be drunk, or in some cases, applied to the womb, accompanied by whispered prayers to Isis, Hathor, or Toret. Isis, the goddess of magic and motherhood, was central to these rituals. Her story raising Osiris from death, conceiving Horus through magic, made her the embodiment of divine fertility. Women called upon her in times of longing and barrenness. Her name was carved into amulets, drawn in ink on walls, and spoken aloud in the silence of night. To utter her name was to open the door between flesh and miracle. Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, and music, was also a key figure in erotic spell work. Her festivals were filled with wine, dance, and sensual joy. In spells, her presence symbolized not just desire, but fulfillment. Her energy was invoked to soften hearts, to stir affections, to rekindle marital warmth. A love potion made in her name might include lotus petals soaked in wine and honey, stored overnight in the moonlight before being secretly added to a drink. These potions were not always shared willingly. Some were brewed in secret, poured quietly into a lover's cup, or sprinkled on clothing. Desire, after all, could be one-sided. Magic offered a way to reach across that distance. Whether ethical or manipulative, these acts remind us that longing, too, is ancient and often desperate. Men, just as often, turned to spells. A young man aching for a woman's affection might consult a magician to craft a binding spell, prayer or curse designed to make the desired person think of him obsessively, lose sleep, or dream of him every night. These spells were written on scraps of papyrus and placed beneath doorways or buried near the target's home. Love was not always gentle. Sometimes it was an act of will. Erotic spells could be highly symbolic, even poetic. A man might write a spell calling his lover the sweet fig of the garden, or describe her hips as wide as the canal of joy. These were not crude incantations. They were intimate, emotional, and charged with longing. Magic, in these moments, became a kind of poetry, one that fused the spiritual and the sensual. Other spells were meant to heighten performance or desire within a marriage. A man who feared losing his potency might wear a phallic amulet inscribed with protective spells. A woman who feared her husband's wandering eye might sleep with a fertility figurine beneath her pillow, believing it would keep his passions directed at home. These were not superstitions, they were strategies, both magical and emotional. Amulets played a major role in sexual and reproductive magic. Small figurines of Base, the dwarf god of pleasure and protection, were hung in bedrooms, or worn on the body, with his lion's mane, bulging eyes, and tongue sticking out. Base was both fierce and joyful, guardian of laughter, birth, and sexual delight. His image was believed to drive away evil and invite bliss. Another popular talisman was the two-finger amulet, shaped like a hand in the gesture used by midwives during birth. This charm symbolized the divine assistance of protective deities, and was often worn by women who hoped to conceive or who wished to protect themselves during intimacy. Incantations were often sung, not just spoken. A spell for conception might be whispered into a bowl of water, then poured over a woman's body. A chant for attraction might be repeated under one's breath as a lover approached. In this way, words themselves became acts of magic carrying energy, shaping destiny, guiding emotion. Sexual magic was not always benevolent. Curses targeting fertility, potency, or desire were real concerns. A jealous rival might cast a spell to cause impotence or prevent conception. These curses were often buried in jars or carved into stones and thrown into canals. To defend against them, counterspells were created, rituals of cleansing, recitation, and protection. One particularly intimate spell involved placing menstrual, blood, or semen on an object, a linen sash, a piece of food, or a doorway as a binding charm. This act fused body and will, embedding one's essence into the spell. It was believed that the target would be drawn irresistibly back to the caster, bound by invisible cords of longing. In temple rituals, fertility magic reached its most exalted form. During festivals of Osiris, symbolic reenactments of his resurrection and union with Isis were performed, acts representing not only divine rebirth but human eroticism. These ceremonies affirmed that sexual energy was not only sacred but essential to the rhythm of the cosmos. The boundary between medicinal and magical remedies was often blurred. A woman who drank a tea of carob and date may have done so for both health and desire. A man who rubbed his body with scented oils might do so for pleasure, but also as a form of enchantment. Everything was layered with meaning. Even the simplest act could hold power. Through these practices, we see a society that did not shrink from desire, nor try to contain it behind walls of guilt. They danced with it, they named it, they sought to shape it through herbs, incantations, gods, and dreams. Love was unpredictable, but magic made it feel just a little more manageable. And in this, perhaps, we are not so different. Whether with roses or whispered texts, with candles or charms, humans still seek ways to call love closer. The ancients simply did it with spells in one hand and amulets in the other, hoping always that someone's heart might turn toward them in the stillness of night. In the timeless hush of ancient Egypt, beneath the gaze of gods and pharaohs, love took many forms. Some were loud, etched in stone, sung in temples, passed down in myth. Others moved quietly, in glances, in poems, in touch. Among these more private truths lies the question of homosexuality, a subject that has long fascinated modern minds, but remains elusive in ancient texts. What did it mean for two men, or two women, to desire each other in a world of divine order and eternal balance? The truth is, ancient Egypt did not define sexuality the way we do today. There were no rigid categories like heterosexual or gay. Instead, what mattered most was social role status, honor, reproduction, and the preservation of the cosmic harmony. Within this structure, expressions of same-sex love or desire may have existed quietly, without institutional support, but also without outright persecution. One of the most cited examples of possible homosexuality in ancient Egypt is the tomb of Kumhotep and Neonkhnum, two royal manicurists who served during the 5th dynasty. Around 2400 BCE, their shared tomb at Saqqara features striking images. The men standing nose to nose, embracing, touching faces, depictions nearly identical to those of married couples. In the inscriptions, they are described as joined in life and joined in death. This visual language has led many scholars to interpret Kumhotep and Neonkhnum as lovers, a same-sex couple, memorialized with dignity. Others argue they were brothers, perhaps twins, bound by affection rather than romance. But the tenderness of their images defies easy explanation. Whether familial or erotic, their intimacy was celebrated, not hidden. The tomb stands as a silent testament to a bond beyond mere duty. Outside of this tomb, direct references to homosexuality in Egyptian literature are rare, but they do exist, sometimes in coded language, sometimes in satire. In the contendings of Horus and Set, a mythological text, the god Set attempts to dominate Horus sexually as a way of humiliating and overpowering him. This act is framed as a political and magical weapon, not a loving union. It's not about desire, it's about control, hierarchy, and shame. What this story tells us is not that homosexual acts were taboo, but that the context mattered deeply. In this tale, the shame lies in being dominated, not in the act itself. Ancient Egyptian masculinity was closely tied to power. and to be in the submissive role, especially in a non-consensual or humiliating context, was seen as a loss of status. Yet the myth also shows that such acts were conceivable, even navigable, within divine drama. This understanding mirrors attitudes in many ancient societies, where the social position one held during a sexual act mattered more than the gender of one's partner. Penetration was tied to dominance. To be passive, especially as a man, was to be feminized and, thus possibly ridiculed. But same-sex desire itself was not inherently condemned. It simply existed outside the framework of reproductive obligation. Among women, the historical record is even quieter. No known Egyptian text directly describes female same-sex relationships, yet silence is not the same as absence. In a society where much of women's private lives were unwritten, it is entirely possible that intimate friendships between women, even romantic or sexual, were lived without needing a public voice. In tombs and letters, expressions of affection between same-gender friends are common. Phrases like, "My heart longs for him," or "She is the joy of my soul," appear in both male and female correspondence. These may have been platonic, or they may have carried deeper meanings. The Egyptians wrote with poetry, not precision, and so much of what we hope to know lies in the space between the lines. There are also hints in moral literature and satire. Some texts warn young men to avoid effeminate company, or speak of men who delight in ornaments and soft linens, phrases that may have implied non-normative gender behavior or same-sex attraction. Yet these warnings are rare and often ambiguous, possibly more about style than sexuality. Temple rituals and festivals sometimes included stressing gender ambiguity and performative queerness. In festivals to Hathor or Bastet, celebrants drank, danced, and slipped between gender roles. These acts were seen not as threats to order, but as celebrations of life's mystery and fluidity. In such spaces, same-sex play may have occurred as rebellion, but as release. Magic, too, allowed for expressions of desire that crossed norms. Spells designed to bind a lover, male or female, were neutral in gender. A man could call for another man's attention through enchantment. A woman could seek affection without needing to name the relationship aloud. The spiritual world, unlike the physical one, had fewer rules. It's also worth noting that Egyptian gods themselves were not confined to binary expressions. Deities like Atum, who created himself and then the world, embodied both masculine and feminine forces. The goddess Mut could appear with both male and female genitalia. In divine terms, gender was expansive. The spiritual realm allowed for fluidity in ways that everyday society may not have openly embraced, but certainly recognized. We must be careful not to impose modern identities on ancient lives. There was no LGBTQ+ community in ancient Thebes, no rainbow flags or parades, but there were people, flesh and blood, who felt the pull of same-gender love, who desired, who longed, who touched, who kept secrets or shared them, who laughed beneath linen sheets in the dim, cool corners of the world. Their stories may not have been written in bold ink, but they were lived, in glances between temple dancers, in shared homes, in private gardens, in prayers whispered to deities who listened without judgment. What remains is a silence that is not empty, but full of space where modern eyes can sense, but not see. A quiet acceptance, a world that did not name queerness, but allowed it to breathe just enough. In this, Egypt reminds us of a deeper truth, that the heart is older than history, that love, in all its forms, has always been part of the human story, and that somewhere, along the Nile, two souls may have walked hand in hand, not needing words, just stars above and warm sand beneath. In the warm winds that curled along the Nile, the ancient Egyptians moved through their days with a reverence for balance, not only in the stars or the river's tides, but in the human body. Hygiene was more than a daily routine. It was a form of worship, a statement of self-respect, and a foundation for health, intimacy, and love. And so, even in matters of sex, cleanliness was not merely encouraged, was essential. From the very beginning, ancient Egyptian culture valued purity. The priests who entered the temples were required to bathe several times a day, before prayer, before offerings, before they stood in the presence of the gods. Their bodies had to be ritually cleansed, and though most Egyptians were not priests, this ideal of cleanliness trickled down into the homes and bedrooms of everyday people. Sex, as a deeply embodied and spiritual act, existed within this framework. It was an experience that joined the physical with the emotional, the sacred with the sensual, and in a land where cleanliness symbolized order and life, both partners were expected to approach intimacy not only with desire but with care. Hygiene was not vanity, it was preparation. Bathing was a central part of daily life. Most homes, at least among the middle and upper classes, had access to water basins and jugs. People washed frequently, especially before meals, prayer, or sleep. In hotter months, the act of washing became both relief and renewal. A clean body meant a clear spirit, and before one touched another's skin, one's own skin had to be worthy. Oils and ointments played a critical role. The dry desert air could crack and parch the skin, but the Egyptians found solutions in the earth. They rubbed their bodies with scented oils often made from lotus, myrrh, or frankincense. These oils not only softened the skin, but served as gentle perfumes. Lovers anointed each other. Fragrance became foreplay. Perfume con small, waxy. Structures infused with scent were sometimes worn on the head during special occasions, slowly melting and releasing fragrance throughout the evening. While mostly ceremonial, these symbols of sensuality likely enhanced sexual encounters. Smell, after all, was memory. It lingered on the sheets. It marked the presence of desire. Hair removal, particularly for women, was another intimate practice linked to hygiene. Body hair was often plucked or shaved using bronze, razors, or tweezers. Smooth skin was associated with youth, fertility, and cleanliness. It was also practical, emitting lice, reducing sweat, and enhancing physical pleasure. Even men trimmed or shaved their pubic hair, especially if they served in temples or elite households. Menstrual hygiene was addressed with simple yet effective materials. Women used soft papyrus or linen tampons, sometimes scented or soaked in oils to ease discomfort. During their cycles, they may have also taken ritual baths or temporarily refrained from certain temple activities. But menstruation wasn't considered shameful, it was natural, another rhythm of life. Before and after sex, washing the body was not just routine, it was protective. Ancient medical texts, like the Ebers Papyrus, advised cleansing the genitals to prevent infections or imbalances. Though the Egyptians lacked modern germ theory, they understood that an unclean body could invite illness or cause pain. Their remedies were rooted in herbs, minerals, and observation. Some lovers also used scented salves or powders before intimacy. These were made from crushed flowers, bark, and spice, mixed with animal fats or beeswax. Applied to the thighs, stomach, or genitals, they warmed the skin and heightened sensation. This wasn't science, it was sensuality guided by nature and intuition. Dental hygiene, too, played a part. Toothbrushes made from frayed twigs, along with powdered abrasives made from crushed pumice, were used to clean the teeth. A pleasant breath was desirable, and a healthy mouth was a sign of attentiveness. The kiss, whether soft or deep, was a gesture of trust. And trust was rooted in preparation. Clothing, especially linen, was washed regularly, sometimes with natron or alkaline soaps. Lovers often changed into clean garments before sex, or discarded them entirely. The act of undressing became ceremonial, a shedding of the day's dust, an offering of one's freshest self. Even undergarments were scented with herbs and placed in reed chests, waiting for private hours. Beds and sleeping spaces were swept and refreshed. Though most people slept on simple mats or low platforms, they often layered them with woven textiles or animal skins. These were shaken out, scented, or replaced before shared nights. A clean space was an invitation. A tidy room whispered of readiness. Temple art and love poetry often alluded to these rituals of care. A lover was praised for the softness of her skin, the sweetness of her breath, the warmth of her scent. These were not exaggerations, they were reflections of hygiene, practiced with pride. To be clean was to be desirable. To be desirable was to be loved. For the wealthy, bathhouses and servant-assisted bathing allowed for more elaborate routines. Women lounged while oils were massaged into their bodies. Men soaked after long journeys. These acts of cleansing were not hidden. They were part of the luxury of life. A well-cared-for body was a symbol of status and of sensual readiness. Even death did not sever this bond between cleanliness and intimacy. The process of mummification was deeply hygienic, an extreme preparation for the afterlife. The body was washed, oiled, perfumed, and wrapped in fine linen. For the Egyptians, a clean body did not die. it was reborn. Thus, we begin to see that sex and hygiene were inseparable in this ancient world. One was the door, the other was the key. Together, they created harmony, a state of readiness, not only for pleasure, but for spiritual balance. For the Egyptians, love required purity not of soul alone, but of skin and scent. And so, in the golden stillness of their homes, lovers bathed before touching. They perfumed their wrists. They shaved with care. They washed away the dust of the world and prepared their bodies for closeness, because to offer yourself to another truly fully was a sacred thing, and sacred things deserve to be clean. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, death was never an ending. It was a transition, a passage from the dust of this world into the reeds and rivers of another, where life flowed on, beautiful and unbroken. And just as the Egyptians painted their tombs with images of feasting, music, and wine, they also carried with them quieter dreams, the hope for love, for touch, for intimacy beyond the grave. To them, sex in the afterlife was not a fantasy, it was a sacred expectation. Unlike many later religions that viewed bodily pleasure as something to transcend, the Egyptians believed that sensuality was part of the soul's happiness. The afterlife, the field of reeds, was not a sterile heaven of clouds and silence. It was a perfected mirror of earthly life. Green fields, warm sun, sweet fruits, soft beds. And in that space, a man and woman might be reunited, or perhaps two men, or two women. What mattered was joy. The deceased hoped to be made whole again, not just in spirit, but in form. This belief is echoed in spells from the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and later, the Book of the Dead. These texts are filled with pleas for bodily restoration, limbs, eyes, breath, organs, and yes, genitals. The soul, or ka, could not enjoy eternity if the body was incomplete. Sexual function was part of that wholeness. Some spells explicitly requested the return of sexual potency. A man might ask that his phallus rise as the mighty bull of heaven, or that he perform the acts of a living man. These were not metaphors. They were hopes for physical love to be restored. The tomb was not a place to forget desire. It was a place to prepare for it once more. Likewise, for women, fertility was not left behind. In tomb inscriptions, wives are often described as she who pleases her husband, or she who causes his heart to rejoice. The implication is not just emotional, it is erotic. The afterlife was meant to include marital intimacy, not erase it. A wife's beauty, her scent, her voice, her body, all were believed to return, fresh and eternal. Even the process of mummification supports this belief. The body was preserved with reverence and care, its form wrapped and protected, its face sometimes painted with youth. Reproductive organs were left intact or treated with particular attention. A man might be mummified with an erect penis, a symbol not of vulgarity, but of vitality, his readiness to live, love, and connect beyond death. Tombs often depict couples, seated side by side, holding hands or embracing. In the tomb of Nebaman, a nobleman, his wife is painted with her arm around him, their eyes meeting with gentle affection. These are not cold memorials. They are love stories, paused waiting to continue, and in the minds of those who painted them, the warmth of that embrace would resume in the next world. The afterlife was also imagined as fertile ground for new life. Some texts suggest that couples could conceive children in the field of reeds. Whether symbolic or literal, this belief reveals a profound respect for sexuality, not as sin, but as sacred creativity. Death was not sterility, it was the soil from which new joy could grow. Sexual desire was not extinguished by age or mortality. Elderly people were often buried with the same wishes and spells as the young. In the afterlife, the body was made new. A tired frame might rise again with vigor. A faded face might glow with youthful allure. The erotic self, so often silenced by time, would sing again in eternity. Magic played a part in ensuring this return. Amulets were buried with the dead, some shaped like ankhs, the symbol of life. Others like jade pillars, representing stability and masculine strength. These were not trinkets. They were tools carried into the next world to protect sexual wholeness and emotional union. Even the gods were believed to continue their intimate unions after death. The myth of Isis and Osiris centers around this very act. After Osiris is killed and dismembered, Isis reassembles his body and conceives their son Horus through magic and divine passion. This story underscores the belief that love and sexuality are not bound by physical limits. They are forces that transcend. For widows and widowers, the hope of reuniting with a beloved was deeply comforting. Tomb inscriptions often included messages like, "To whom I long to return," or "May we be joined again in the West." These were not just spiritual yearnings, they were erotic as well. The desire to touch, to kiss, to lie beside a partner, once more pulsed beneath the stone. Homosexual couples may have held similar dreams, though their voices are harder to find in the record. Still, in a world where the afterlife mirrored personal truth, it's not difficult to imagine two men buried together, hoping to walk once more beneath the sycamore trees, hand in hand, free from judgment. The Book of the Dead, which served as a guide through the afterlife, contains spells to ensure that the soul has access to all the pleasures of life: food, drink, song, dance, and sensuality. The soul is even given the ability to transform into birds, snakes, or gods to roam freely, without limitation. In such freedom, erotic pleasure was surely not forbidden. This belief in posthumous intimacy may also have influenced how people lived. If one believed that love would continue beyond death, then fidelity, tenderness, and connection in life held even deeper meaning. To cherish a partner now was to invest in a reunion later. Every kiss was eternal. Sex in the afterlife was never described with shame. It was not hidden. It was included in sacred texts, rituals, art, and dreams. It was as essential as breath. For the Egyptians, joy was not something to leave behind. It was something to carry forward, draped in linen, written in spells, remembered. In the heart, there is, of course, much we do not know. The voices of the poor, the unmarried, the queer, the lonely. These voices were often left out of tomb inscriptions, but the universal nature of the hope for pleasure, for reunion, for embrace suggests it belonged to everyone, not just the elite. And so, in the field of reeds, under eternal sky, the Egyptians believed they would rise again, not only to toil or to pray, but to laugh, to kiss, to lie close in the cool grass, skin against skin. Life did not end, nor did love, nor the sacred heat between bodies that knew each other well. Every society has its boundaries, even in ancient Egypt, so often remembered for its openness to sensuality, its sacred embrace of eroticism. There were lines that were not meant to be crossed. Behind the celebration of fertility and love, there existed a quieter set of rules, taboos, spoken and unspoken, rooted in myth, lore, and cosmic order. These boundaries shaped how Egyptians navigated the more secret corners of human desire. For the Egyptians, Mat, the goddess of truth, order, and balance, was the center of all things. Maintaining Mat meant keeping the universe in harmony, and sexual behavior was a critical part of that harmony. Not all sex was sacred. Not all desire was accepted. Some acts were believed to disturb the very fabric of society and the divine order that held it together. One of the most complex taboos was incest outside the royal family. While pharaohs often married sisters or daughters to preserve divine bloodlines, such unions among common people were heavily discouraged, even punished. Marriage between close blood relatives, siblings, parents and children was seen as deeply unnatural, violating the lineage of the gods unless justified by divine heritage. Among the royal elite, incest was portrayed as sacred imitation. Among commoners, it was a breach. Adultery, too, carried heavy consequences, especially for women. A married woman caught in an affair could face severe social and legal penalties, ranging from divorce and disgrace to corporal punishment or worse. For men, the rules were more lenient, but not entirely permissive. If a man seduced a married woman of high status, the offense could escalate to treason. Sexual access was tied to honor, property, and the integrity of household lines. The sexual abuse of children was unambiguously taboo, though it's important to note that ancient records rarely speak directly of such acts. In a culture so centered around fertility and family continuity, harming a child physically or sexually would have been viewed as deeply polluting. Some legal texts condemn acts that seem to hint at inappropriate contact with minors, wrapped in euphemism or metaphor. But the moral tone is unmistakable. Sexual activity with animals, bestiality, was another boundary that appears in certain legal or mythological warnings, usually to condemn foreign cultures or describe behaviors attributed to enemies of Egypt. These references are rare and always negative, suggesting that such acts were associated with chaos, madness, or the breakdown of civilization. They were outside the realm of accepted nature, and by extension, outside of Mat. One particularly vivid myth describes the god Seth attempting to sexually overpower the god Horus, not out of lust, but as an assertion of dominance. The act is framed as humiliating and disruptive of cosmic imbalance. Horus ultimately outwits Seth, preserving divine order. The tale illustrates how rape, especially same-sex rape, framed as a power move, was understood not as erotic, but as dangerous and destructive. There were also taboos around menstruation in specific contexts. While menstruating women were not seen as impure in a moral sense, their presence in temples or sacred spaces during their cycle was often restricted. It was believed that certain bodily states, including menstrual bleeding, disrupted ritual cleanliness. In private life, however, there's little evidence of stigma suggesting a division between the spiritual and domestic spheres. Necrophilia, the act of engaging in sexual acts with the dead, is hinted at in a chilling passage recorded by Herodotus, who claimed that embalmers were sometimes prohibited from preparing the bodies of recently deceased beautiful women until they had decomposed slightly, to avoid temptation. While it's unclear how common this was or how much is exaggeration, the very mention of the act suggests it was understood, condemned, and feared. There were also sexual taboos tied to temple service. While temple musicians and dancers may have lived lives full of beauty and admiration, engaging in sexual acts, especially with priests or worshippers outside of sanctioned ritual, could lead to punishment. The temple was a place of divine purity, and any form of exploitation or abuse of its workers violated the sanctity of the space. Magic was sometimes used to enforce or punish sexual taboos. A spurned lover might commission a cursed tablet, calling for impotence, infertility, or shame to fall upon someone who crossed forbidden boundaries. These curses could be written in blood, buried in cemeteries, or sunk in the Nile. They served as warnings from the invisible world. Incestuous deities themselves, such as Isis and Osiris, who were siblings as well as lovers, represented a divine exception, not a model for human behavior. These unions belonged to the mythic world, where gods existed before laws. The Egyptian people, even in admiring these gods, were not expected to replicate their unions in their own households. There were also instances in which sexual deviance was used as political slander. A rival might be accused of seducing servants, violating temple virgins, or engaging in shameful acts to erode their standing. In these cases, sexual taboo became a weapon, not necessarily proof of behavior, but a stain on one's honor. Art and poetry generally celebrated sex with warmth, but certain satirical papyri depict exaggerated sexual scenes that cross the line into absurdity, hinting at acts considered grotesque or immoral. These works served as moral commentary as much as entertainment, poking fun at those who ignored propriety. While the Egyptian worldview allowed space for sensuality, sexual excess, especially outside marriage or religious purpose, was warned against. The concept of hedonistic imbalance appears in wisdom literature, urging restraint and respect. Overindulgence was seen as a slide into chaos, the antithesis of Mat. The line between sacred sexuality and profane misuse was fine, and crossing it often led not only to social shame, but to fears of spiritual corruption. Taboos were not only legal, they were cosmic. They threatened to unweave the order of the world, and so they were feared even in death. In funerary texts, the soul is often judged not only by truthfulness or generosity, but by sexual conduct. The famous negative confession from the Book of the Dead includes phrases like, "I have not committed fornication. I have not defiled the wife of a man. I have not caused anyone to weep." These were moral acts, judged by the gods themselves. And so, while ancient Egypt embraced pleasure, it also guarded against disruption. The human body was a vessel of joy, but it was also bound to laws, both written and divine. When pleasure veered into destruction, it became taboo. And the Egyptians, lovers of beauty and balance, feared that as much as death itself. Behind the colossal walls of Egypt's royal palaces, behind the golden masks and official portraits, desire pulsed quietly, sometimes whispered in silken corridors, sometimes shouted in scandal across generations. Royalty was divine in name, but not in temperament. Pharaohs and queens, like all people, loved, betrayed, yearned, and sometimes succumbed to the temptations their titles could not shield them from. And when they did, The echoes of their passion left stains on stone and in history's memory. Ancient Egypt, though largely conservative in its expectations of public behavior, allowed its rulers extraordinary leeway. A king was not merely a man, he was the embodiment of Horus, the living god. His word was law, his body was sovereign. And yet, when the private desires of kings and queens crossed certain lines, moral, political, or religious rumors became history, and discretion gave way to infamy. Perhaps the most enduring example of royal sexual controversy comes from the reign of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Known for overthrowing the traditional gods and centering worship on the Aten, Akhenaten also unsettled his court with his intimate relationships. His bond with Nefertiti was famous. She was depicted as his equal in temple art, shown kissing him, touching him tenderly, riding in chariots side by side. But there were whispers of other relationships, possibly with his own daughters, as some depictions hint at levels of closeness that, if interpreted literally, would suggest incest beyond even divine justification. Even more enigmatic is relationship with Smenkhare, a young male regent, or possibly lover, who shared the throne during the later years of his rule. Artistic portrayals of Smenkhare in close embrace with Akhenaten have led some historians to speculate about a romantic or sexual connection. Though proof remains elusive, the suggestion alone paints a picture of a ruler whose passions, like his theology, defied norms. After Akhenaten's death, his young son Tutankhamun ascended the throne. Married to his half-sister Enkhsanemen, Tutankhamun was part of a dynasty deeply marked by incestuous unions. Their marriage, though politically necessary to preserve royal bloodlines, may have been complicated by the burden of genetic illness. The mummies of their stillborn children were found in his tomb, adding sorrow and fragility to the image of this young royal couple. Enkhsanemen's story did not end with Tutankhamun's death. Widowed at a young age, she took an extraordinary step. She wrote to the Hittite king, begging him to send a son for her to marry. "I do not wish to marry a servant," she wrote, a rare and bold statement. Whether out of desperation or ambition, her plea suggests she was attempting to escape the suffocating expectations of her court, possibly in search of both political alliance and personal autonomy. The Hittite prince never arrived. He was murdered en route, in what many believe was an act of political sabotage. Centuries earlier, the great Queen Hatshepsut had scandalized Egypt in a different way, not through overt romance, but through her decision to rule as king. Donning male regalia, including the ceremonial false beard, she took on full pharaonic power, though there is no surviving record of sexual scandal during her reign. Later, kings attempted to erase her memory, perhaps unsettled by her unprecedented authority. In Egyptian memory, a powerful woman was often made suspect even if no affair was proven. Then came Cleopatra VII, perhaps the most famous symbol of royal sexual intrigue. Though Greek by blood, she ruled as Egypt's last true pharaoh and captivated not only her subjects but the Roman world. Her liaisons with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were political and passionate. She bore children by both men, used her intelligence and charisma to secure power, and ruled as an equal beside Antony until their tragic end. To Roman enemies, she was painted as a seductress and sorceress, the embodiment of exotic danger. But in Egyptian eyes, she was the final flowering of pharaonic grace. Cleopatra's sexual agency, real or exaggerated, became her legacy. Yet her story reflects a wider truth about Egyptian rulers. Their private lives were public concern. Love, lust, betrayal, or strategic marriage could make or unmake dynasties. It wasn't just about hearts. It was about thrones. In the earlier dynasties, some kings were rumored to maintain harems, collections of wives and concubines. Many foreign-born used both for pleasure and diplomacy. The harem was not merely a space of indulgence, it was also political, housing royal children and shaping the next generation of leaders. But when power shifted within its walls, the consequences could be explosive. Take the harem conspiracy during the reign of Ramesses III, where one of his secondary wives, Tai, orchestrated a plot to assassinate the king so her son could seize the throne. This scandal, detailed in the judicial papyrus of Turin, involved magic, seduction, and a network of conspirators. It reminds us that royal sexuality was never just personal, it was political leverage, sometimes deadly. Sexual affairs, especially between high officials and royal women, were especially dangerous. The line between love and treason could be Paperthin, a princess who strayed could bring ruin on her family. A courtier who dared cross that line risked death, exile, or erasure. The stakes were not only emotional, they were existential. Even in the serene artwork of the New Kingdom, where queens walk in beauty beside their kings, there lingers a tension. We see affection, yes, but also power dynamics. A single affair, real or rumored, could reshape court alliances, incite rebellions, or inspire temple gossip that lasted for generations. Sometimes, royal sexuality was hidden behind euphemism. Official inscriptions might say, "A king was beloved of the gods," or "fruitful like the Nile," hinting at sexual virility without naming specific acts. Other times, graffiti told the truths official records dared not, scrawled on the walls of workers' villages, like Deir el-Medina, filled with jokes, caricatures, and insults. The Egyptian people were not blind to the failings or excesses of their rulers. Satirical papyri mocked royal figures in explicit detail. Poets used innuendo to critique corruption. Artists sometimes hid scandalous commentary in the margins of grand temple scenes. Beneath the grandeur, there was always gossip. But despite the dangers of scandal, some rulers wore their passions with pride. Love was not weakness. Desire was not always hidden. For a pharaoh, to be desired could be a form of divine approval. To inspire longing was to inspire loyalty. And in the dance of politics, seduction could be the sharpest weapon of all. In the end, royal sexual scandals were never just about the body. They were about power, legacy, inheritance, and myth. They whispered behind closed doors and echoed through eternity, scandals buried beneath gold, but never fully forgotten. The Egyptians were masters of suggestion. In a land where the divine touched every grain of sand, where words themselves were considered alive, sexuality was rarely shouted, but it was always there, woven into art and language like perfume clinging to linen. To truly understand ancient Egyptian sexuality, one must learn to look sideways, to see what was not said outright but always present in a curve of a hip. A blossoming lotus, a bird perched just so. Unlike modern cultures that often separate the erotic from the sacred, the Egyptians fused them through symbolism. To them, the sexual was not profane, it was elemental. And because it was elemental, it did not need to be graphic. Hieroglyphs and temple carvings conveyed deep sensual meaning with stunning restraint, embedding passion within petals and gods. Take, for example, the lotus flower, one of the most powerful sexual symbols in Egyptian art. The lotus blooms from murky water, opens to the sun each day, and closes at night. This natural rhythm was interpreted as both a symbol of resurrection and female sexuality. In love poetry, a man might describe his lover as a lotus, fragrant, open, elusive. In tomb paintings, lotus blossoms offered to a partner may carry quiet, erotic undertones, blooming with invitation. The papyrus stalk, another recurring image, was slender and supple, linked to male virility. When a man is shown grasping a bunch of papyrus, it may be more than decoration. It may be a visual whisper of his strength, his fertility, his readiness. In hieroglyphic love poetry, plucking papyrus could mean many things, not all of them botanical. Then there were animals, each with its own sexual subtext. The bull, for instance, was not merely a farm creature, it was a symbol of male potency. Bulls were associated with gods like Apis and Min, whose roles included fertility and masculine power. When a pharaoh was described as strong as a bull, it was not simply a compliment to his muscles. It was a nod to his sexual dominance and ability to father heirs. Similarly, birds, especially doves and geese, were linked with affection and courtship. The gentle nuzzling of two birds in tomb art might seem innocent, but in the language of ancient symbology, it often represented intimate connection, love, and even sexual harmony. Pigeons cooing on temple walls could carry as much romantic weight as an embrace. Gods themselves were portrayed with symbolic attributes that alluded to sex. The god Min, for instance, was frequently depicted with an erect phallus and a flail. In his hand, he wasn't hidden or mocked. He was worshipped as a god of fertility. Offerings to Min included lettuces, lettuce believed to have aphrodisiac properties. Even vegetables became vessels of innuendo. Hieroglyphs did not shy away from genital imagery entirely, but they transformed it into stylized metaphors. The hieroglyph for the phallus was used not only in medical and magical texts, but also in hymns and fertility invocations. The female genitalia, while less frequently depicted, appears in certain ritual texts as a portal to creation. reflecting the womb of the goddess Nut or the birthing canal of the earth. Love poems, written in hieratic or cursive script on papyrus, are some of the most revealing artifacts of symbolic eroticism. In these verses, lovers speak not of bodies in explicit terms, but of crossing the river, tasting the fruit, or resting in the garden. The meanings are layered, sometimes innocent, sometimes clearly sensual. To the Egyptian reader, the metaphors danced with meaning. In wall art, gestures and body posture often carried coded sexual significance. A man and woman standing close, with one arm draped across the shoulder, signified emotional intimacy. If the woman is shown sniffing a lotus or holding it to the man's chest, the scene likely hints at romantic or erotic longing. A shared touch wasn't merely decorative, was declarative. Even color had erotic associations. The color red, especially when painted on women, symbolized passion, vitality, and heat. Red ochre was used to tint cheeks and lips, enhancing allure. In contrast, green, associated with Osiris and rebirth, suggested fertility and renewal. A green-skinned god rising from death was not just a symbol of eternity. It was a reminder of the eternal nature of desire. Sometimes, absence itself was the message. The lack of overt sexuality in public reliefs didn't mean the Egyptians were prudish, quite the opposite. They believed that certain things were too powerful to name directly. To portray sex in veiled imagery was to honor its mystery. What was sacred was not shouted, it was preserved in silence. In funerary texts and tomb art, scenes of harvesting, fishing, or dancing were often symbolic of sexual union. The act of casting a net or tilling soil mirrored creation myths. God spilled seed, gave birth to worlds, or fertilized the sky. To plant was to penetrate, to harvest was to receive. Nature was their metaphorical canvas. Even architecture participated in this coded language. The long, towering obelisks erected in temple courtyards symbolized solar energy and divine masculinity. Their shape, unmistakably phallic, pointed toward the heavens, connecting earth to sky, man to God. They were monuments of both cosmic alignment and human virility. Eroticism in art also lived in private places. The Turin erotic papyrus, possibly never intended for public eyes, reveals that the Egyptians could also be boldly graphic when the space allowed. Its exaggerated depictions were satirical and perhaps comical, yet they affirmed that sexuality was a known, natural part of life, one that could be celebrated in secret, even if muted in public. Yet, amidst all these symbols, the Egyptians never forgot the deeper truth, that sexuality was more than pleasure. It was continuity, rebirth, and connection. Every image, every hieroglyph, every metaphor spoke not only of bodies but of bonds. To love was to align oneself with the cycles of nature, the rhythm of gods, the heartbeat of the Nile. Today, as we gaze at those ancient walls, at the curved lotus, the embracing figures, the bold bulls, we step into a visual language as rich and nuanced as poetry. A world where sex was sacred and hidden, not because it was shameful, but because it was powerful. Too depicted too clearly might have shattered the spell. And so, in the art and hieroglyphs of Egypt, sexuality remains alive, not frozen in time, but waiting to be read. Not exposed, but eternal. A whisper carved in stone. The sands of Egypt have long been silent, their voices muffled by time. Yet if you listen closely, there is a rhythm still beating beneath them. It is not only the thrum of empire or the chant of gods, it is the softer sound, more human, more eternal, the whispered laughter of lovers, the tender breath of bodies beneath linen, the aching truth of longing, inscribed not in books, but in the spaces between them. Unlike many civilizations that came after, ancient Egypt did not build its moral foundation on repression. Instead, it embraced the body as a natural extension of the divine. Sexuality, in all its complexity, was not something to be hidden in shame, but to be understood, ritualized, celebrated. This is perhaps the most radical truth they offer us. Standing across the centuries. In their art, we find gentle touches. In their poetry, yearning sighs. In their rituals, acts of symbolic union that echoed the coupling of sky and earth, sun and seed, mother and son. Sex, for the Egyptians, was not a problem to solve. It was a force to honor, a language of its own, sometimes sacred, sometimes humorous, always real. They carved it into stone without vulgarity. They painted it onto tomb walls with reverence. Even their gods took lovers, desired bodies, and conceived worlds in passion. Where other cultures split flesh and spirit, Egypt married them. To be alive was to be whole. To desire was to be divine. This wasn't a culture without boundaries. There were clear lines between celebration and violation, between harmony and chaos. But those lines were drawn with care, not fear. What mattered most was balance, the principle of Mat, pleasure without destruction, love without coercion, passion without loss of order. Sex was part of health. It was part of identity. It was part of the afterlife. Whether through fertility spells or erotic verses, perfumed oils or funeral amulets, sexuality followed Egyptians from birth to death, and beyond. Their graves were not just vessels for bones. They were chambers of memory, longing, and hope. A husband and wife, buried side by side, their hands nearly touching on the wall behind them. A poem written in soft ink. I passed by her house, and my heart stopped. A prayer to Min or Hathor, for fertility, for connection. These fragments do not lie. They speak clearly. Sex was life. Even the concept of sin, which dominates many modern frameworks of morality, did not map neatly onto Egyptian thought. There were transgressions, yes, betrayals, abuses, chaos, but desire itself was never the crime. The misuse of it was, and even then, redemption was possible through ritual, through confession, through restoration of balance. This perspective gave the people freedom. A young man might dream of a lover. A woman might speak of her longing. A priest might cleanse himself not to deny desire, but to refine it, to offer his body as a vessel of sacred connection, not suppression. The body was not a cage, it was a channel. And in a world where death was never final, even passion endured. Couples prayed to be reunited in the field of reeds, to walk side by side once more, to lie beneath sycamore trees, bathed in eternal breeze. Their concept of eternity was not sterile, it was sensual, filled with taste, scent, touch, music, laughter. Today, much of this is misunderstood. Pop culture often reduces Egyptian sexuality to scandal, to fetish, to exotic spectacle. But the truth is subtler and far more dignified. This was not a society obsessed with indulgence. It was a civilization that believed intimacy could be sacred, and that to understand desire was to understand creation itself. When we look at ancient Egyptian sex through modern eyes filtered by centuries of moral shame or religious repression, risk missing the essence. To them, a kiss was a spell, a touch was a rite, an embrace was a kind of music. Even the most private of acts carried echoes of the cosmos. It is easy to romanticize the past, but what makes Egypt's approach truly extraordinary is how grounded it was. It acknowledged the needs of the body without forgetting the needs of the soul. It left room for pleasure and poetry, for rules and rebellion, for love and law. It was not perfect, but it was honest. The Egyptians knew that sexuality could bring both creation and collapse, that it could unify or unravel, and so they treated it with care, not denial, not taboo, but reverence. They asked how it fit into the larger harmony of life, and when it did, they celebrated it openly, artfully, beautifully. As we close this journey, we are left not only with knowledge, but with perspective. In a world increasingly polarized around issues of intimacy and identity, the Egyptians remind us that there is another way, a way where the sacred and the sensual are not enemies, a way where love can be law, and passion can be peace. In their temples, bodies met in dance. In their homes, lovers whispered beneath woven sheets. In their scrolls, the language of touch became poetry. And in their tombs, sex walked beside death, not as a stranger, but as a friend. This was not a culture that feared desire. This was a culture that knew it was part of the divine equation, that without it, nothing could grow. No river could rise, no womb could bloom, no joy could ripple across time. And perhaps, in understanding their view of the body, we find something of our own acquired truth, carved in limestone and scented with myrrh. That desire, when guided by balance and love, does not diminish the soul. It completes it.